Hot pie sellers shouting in rhymes to attract customers. Ever wonder what medieval tick-tock sounded like? It wasn't dancing. It was vendors shouting rhymes about hot pies. Step into a bustling medieval street for a second. The cobblestones are wet. The air smells like smoke, sweat, and baked meat. And above the clatter of hooves and church bells, you hear a chorus of voices calling out, "Hot pies, piping hot, fresh from the pan, meat for your man." It's chaotic, funny, and somehow musical. Those cries weren't random noise, they were marketing. In the Middle Ages, food vendors didn't have menus or neon signs, so they turned their lungs into advertising machines. Hot pie sellers were the medieval version of fast food workers, and their brand jingles were shouted into crowded markets every single day. Most of them were poor. Widows, injured soldiers, or street kids who needed to make quick cash. They'd bake small meat or eel pies in home ovens or rent space from a local baker, then carry the goods in baskets covered with cloth to keep the steam in. When the scent hit the street, they'd start their rhythmic chants, rhymes that stuck in your head like a catchy radio ad. Think of it as medieval street music meets marketing. These cries weren't just noise, they were a city's heartbeat. People knew exactly what was being sold by the sound alone. A vendor's cry became their signature. In London, food sellers were even legally allowed to cry their wares, and city officials sometimes regulated how loud or how often they could do it. Still, most ignored the rules. The louder the cry, the more coins you earned. The pies themselves were the perfect street food. The crust acted like a natural container, no forks or plates needed. Inside was anything from minced beef to eel or pigeon, depending on what the seller could afford that week. The dough, called a coffin, was often too tough to eat, but it kept your hands clean while walking. Quick, cheap, and filling, exactly what tired workers or travelers wanted. Of course, not every hot pie was actually hot. Some sellers reheated leftovers and hoped no one noticed. Others used meat that was questionably fresh. A few got caught and punished. One record from 14th century London mentions a pie seller jailed for stuffing pies with spoiled fish. Still, people kept buying them because they were cheap and everywhere. Writers from the time both loved and hated these noisy vendors. One chronicler complained that the streets were rung with the cries of pie and pudding. Another joked that if you walked past 10 stalls, you'd leave with a dozen songs stuck in your head. In a way, those sellers invented audio branding long before jingles or slogans existed. Their rhymes were catchy, their food was fast, and their hustle was relentless. So next time you hear a food truck jingle or a delivery ad, remember, 500 years ago someone was already out there shouting into the crowd, "Hot pies, piping hot," and hoping you'd buy a taste of warmth before it went cold.
Meat pasties wrapped in edible coffins of dough for portability. You know how we grab a sandwich when we're on the go? In the Middle Ages, they grabbed a coffin. Before you panic, coffin didn't always mean a box for the dead. In medieval kitchens, that word meant a crust, a tough, thick, hand-molded shell of dough that wrapped around meat, fish, or vegetables, the lunchbox of its time. And just like today's convenience foods, the genius of the medieval pasty was all about portability. You could eat it anywhere, in the fields, on the road, or while gossiping at the market. These meat pasties weren't the delicate, flaky pastries we know today. Their dough was built to survive a medieval commute. It was thick, dense, and sometimes baked rock hard, forming what people called a coffin crust. It didn't even have to taste good. Its job was to contain, not to delight. Think of it as the edible version of Tupperware. The filling inside, though, was where the magic happened. Cooks packed in chopped beef, pork or venison if you were lucky, eel or offal if you weren't. They added onions, leeks, herbs, and sometimes dried fruit for a sweet, savory kick. For workers and travelers, these things were priceless. A pasty could last for days without spoiling, which was a big deal in a world with no refrigerators and lots of mud. You could throw one into your satchel, hop on a horse, and have lunch ready when the church bells rang noon. Even knights on campaign carried them. Archaeologists have found old oven sites near castles with markings suggesting bulk-baked pies and pasties made just for soldiers. Now, here's the weirdly human part. People decorated their pasties. Bakers stamped little designs on the tops, sometimes showing the owner's initials or the cook's symbol. In a communal oven where dozens were baked together, it was the medieval version of labeling your food so nobody steals it. And when it came out of the oven, that coffin was sealed tight. The rich sometimes ate the crust. The poor often didn't. They'd crack it open, scoop out the meat, and toss the hardened shell to dogs or beggars. Wasteful? Sure, but efficient. Over time, though, cooks realized that if you made the crust thinner and used better flour, the coffin became tasty too. That's how the edible pasty evolved. It stopped being just a container and became a meal in itself. In Cornwall in later centuries, miners carried pasties with one savory end and one sweet end, so they could eat dinner and dessert with 30 hands, holding the crust edge like a built-in handle. So the next time you bite into a Hot Pocket, calzone, or empanada, you're basically eating an idea born 700 years ago. A portable pie designed for people who didn't have time to sit down. The name might have been grim, but the invention was brilliant. The medieval coffin wasn't about death, it was about lunch on the move.
Oyster cellars, medieval London's cheapest fast snack. Ever thought oysters were a luxury food? Back in medieval London, they were the street peanuts of the poor. If you picture medieval London, you might imagine grand banquets and gold goblets, but most people were just trying to get something cheap and filling between shifts at the docks or stints hauling carts through the muck. Their go-to snack? Oysters. Not the candle-lit restaurant kind, but quick, salty bites slurped from a wooden bowl for a few coppers. Oysters were so common they were practically fast food, messy, plentiful, and everywhere you turned near the Thames. In the 1300s and 1400s, the Thames estuary was teeming with oyster beds. The river wasn't yet an industrial sewer, so shellfish flourished. Barges full of oysters came upriver daily, dumped into barrels, and rolled into the city's open markets.
There, vendors, mostly women with rough hands and loud voices, would set up makeshift stands or walk the streets balancing baskets on their heads. They'd holler, "Fresh oysters, fat and fair," to lure workers on their lunch break. The sound of oyster knives scraping shells was the background music of London's markets. These oysters were nothing fancy. They were eaten raw, roasted, or thrown into pottage to stretch a meal. People even crumbled them into pies with onions and pepper, the original seafood combo. The rich ate them too, but theirs came spiced and plated. For everyone else, it was more like grabbing a paper cone of fries, cheap, quick, and salty. And here's the strange twist. Oysters were considered poor people's food. They grew wild, required no farming, and cost almost nothing. Laborers living on bread and ale could add protein and minerals just by buying a handful of oysters on the way home. Records from medieval households show servants and prisoners being fed oysters in bulk. They were that abundant. It's wild to think that the same thing that now costs $20 a dozen used to be handed out by the bucket load to peasants. Oyster sellers were also known for their personalities. They had to be. Competition was fierce. You might find one woman selling raw oysters from a tub filled with river water, while another roasted them over a small brazier, sprinkling salt to draw a crowd. Some would even flirt or joke with customers to boost sales, earning reputations as the life of the market. They were the original street performers, salespeople, comedians, and cooks all in one. But the golden oyster age didn't last forever. By the 17th and 18th centuries, pollution and overharvesting wiped out the easy supply. Prices rose and oysters climbed the social ladder from peasant snack to aristocratic delicacy. So the next time you see oysters sitting on crushed ice at a high-end restaurant, imagine a muddy-footed Londoner centuries ago, standing in a noisy street, tossing his shell into the gutter after a quick bite. For them, it wasn't a luxury. It was lunch. And for a few brief, salty centuries, oysters were the fast food that fueled a whole city.
Bread trenchers used as disposable plates, early takeout containers. Before paper plates or styrofoam boxes, medieval diners just ate their dishes, literally. Picture a long wooden table in a dim medieval tavern. Candles flicker, ale sloshes, and instead of fancy china, your meal is served on a thick, flat slab of bread called a trencher. No forks, no plates, just a hunk of stale loaf doing double duty as your dish and your mop. When you finished eating, you didn't wash up. You either ate your plate or tossed it to the dogs. Welcome to medieval takeout. A trencher was usually made from yesterday's bread, cut into thick, square slices. Fresh bread was too soft to hold heavy stews, so cooks let it harden first. Once solid, it became the perfect edible surface, absorbent, disposable, and cheap. When the cook ladled hot meat or pottage on top, the gravy soaked into the bread, softening it again just enough to make it delicious, or disgusting, depending on how you feel about soggy carbs. In big households, trenchers came in pairs. 2 diners shared one loaf between them, sitting side by side. The rich might use a clean one for each course, while peasants used one all day. It was fast, simple, and hygienic by medieval standards. There were no piles of dishes to scrub, no soap to waste, and no servants stuck at the sink, because the sink was a dog waiting under the table. It's easy to laugh now, but the trencher was ingenious. It solved 3 medieval problems at once: lack of utensils, scarcity of clean water, and the need to stretch food. A poor man's dinner might just be the leftover trencher from a wealthy feast, soaked in meat juice, but still edible. Monks sometimes gave their used trenchers to beggars as charity. It wasn't glamorous, but in a hungry world, even gravy-soaked bread meant survival. Archaeologists and historians actually trace dining customs through trenchers. The word itself comes from the Old French, trancher, meaning to slice. By the 14th century, wooden trenchers began replacing bread ones among the upper class, basically the medieval upgrade to reusable plates. But for the common folk, edible tableware stuck around for centuries. Why waste a good crust? Even kings used them. There's a record of King Henry VIII's banquets describing servants laying out fine manchet bread trenchers, carefully cut, baked, and discarded after the feast. It's oddly modern, single-use, convenient, and thrown away without a thought. Medieval consumer culture at its crummiest. Next time you unwrap a burger or open a paper lunchbox, think of those old tavern tables. People were doing takeaway long before restaurants even existed, scooping stew off a bread plate, wiping their hands on their sleeves, and tossing the leftovers to the floor. It's messy, clever, and perfectly medieval. Because when it came to eating fast and cleaning faster, nothing beat a good loaf of hard bread, the original, eco-friendly, 100% biodegradable takeout container.
Roasted chestnuts and turnips sold from portable braziers. Think of it as the medieval version of a food cart. Only instead of hot dogs, you got steaming chestnuts and smoky turnips cooked right on the street. If you ever wandered through a medieval city on a chilly evening, the first thing you'd notice wasn't the smell of horse manure or damp stone. It was the smoky sweetness drifting from a little metal pan glowing red in the night. That was the sound and smell of dinner on the go. Roasted chestnuts and turnips sold by the handful from portable braziers. Before street food had a name, it was a way of life. Vendors carried small metal braziers, basically tiny charcoal stoves, slung on a strap or mounted on a wooden cart. Inside, they kept a few coals alive all day long, fanning them with a bit of straw when business picked up. Chestnuts popped and cracked as they roasted, their shells blackened and sweet smoke curling through the air. Turnips, on the other hand, were the poor man's potato before potatoes even existed in Europe. Vendors sliced them, salted them, and roasted them until the edges crisped and the centers went soft like butter. For the working class, this was the ultimate comfort food. You didn't need a table or a knife. You just bought a warm handful wrapped in paper or cloth and kept walking. During winter, the braziers doubled as mini heaters, and people would crowd around them to warm their hands while snacking. Some vendors even rented out small corners of the market, lighting up the night like little constellations of glowing embers. Chestnuts were cheap, filling, and surprisingly nutritious, high in carbs, sweet enough to feel like a treat, but sturdy enough to travel. Turnips, meanwhile, were grown everywhere, stored easily through winter,
and cost almost nothing. For townsfolk who couldn't afford meat pies or alehouse meals, a hot turnip from the brazier meant survival and a moment of warmth in a cold, drafty world. These vendors were the backbone of urban life. They worked in all weather, often starting before dawn and going until the church bells tolled curfew. The streets were alive with their cries, "Hot chestnuts! Hot turnips!" echoing between stone walls. And they weren't just commoners. In big cities like Paris and London, even wealthy people bought roasted chestnuts as a quick snack on the way home from church. It was the only food that cut across every class because everyone wanted something warm in their hands. Sometimes, though, things got dangerous. A tipped brazier could start a fire fast in those timber-filled streets, and city guards often fined vendors for blocking alleys or leaving scorch marks on cobblestones. Still, they kept coming back, because everyone needed them. So next time you walk past a roasted peanut stand or smell grilled corn on a cold night, you're catching a whiff of the Middle Ages. Long before streetlights or food trucks, there were tired vendors standing by the glow of their coals, selling a bit of warmth for a penny. One roasted chestnut, one golden turnip, one hungry customer at a time.
Barley porridge stands for the poor. Before food trucks rolled up with tacos and lattes, medieval cities had their own version. A woman with a pot of barley porridge and a wooden ladle, feeding half the street for a penny. If you were broke in a medieval town, your best hope for a hot meal wasn't an inn or a tavern, it was the porridge seller. These vendors popped up at dawn, hauling big iron pots of barley pottage that had been simmering all night over a communal hearth. They'd set up on street corners, near markets, or outside churches, shouting their offers like early morning DJs. "Hot pottage, thick and warm." For a few coins, or sometimes a favor, you'd get a ladleful of steaming barley mush that could keep you full all day. Barley porridge, or pottage as people called it, was the backbone of the medieval diet. It was the ultimate everything stew. Barley, water, maybe a splash of milk if you were lucky, and whatever scraps were lying around. Onions, beans, herbs, sometimes a hint of bacon fat. It was cheap, filling, and endlessly customizable, which made it perfect for vendors trying to feed a crowd. In a world without refrigeration or steady jobs, the porridge stand was survival made simple. Hot, safe food that didn't spoil fast. Most of these vendors were women, widows, nuns, or poor housewives trying to make ends meet. They carried their kettles on carts, wheelbarrows, or even slung over hooks, like mobile kitchens before wheels and branding came into play. They'd set up in the busiest spots, usually by city gates or near workers' housing. People lined up with their own wooden bowls or bread trenchers, got a scoop, and went on their way. In some towns, the same woman became a daily ritual, like your neighborhood barista, but with porridge instead of coffee. And here's the beautiful irony. While nobles feasted on roast peacock and sugar sculptures, most of Europe ran on pottage. The smell of boiling barley and leeks was the scent of ordinary life. It was cheap enough for beggars and respectable enough for monks.
Hospitals, orphanages, and monasteries even ran permanent porridge kitchens, early versions of soup kitchens, ladling out food to whoever needed it. For medieval cities, these stands were more than food stalls. They were social hubs. People traded gossip while waiting, arranged work deals, even flirted over a shared bowl. And since porridge was safe to eat hot and easy to keep warm, vendors could sell from dawn to dusk without much waste. The same bubbling pot might serve dozens throughout the day, topped up with more water or grain when it got low. Of course, health inspectors didn't exist, and clean was a flexible concept. But even with smoky flavor and the occasional pebble in your bowl, that porridge was the only meal some people got. So when you see a modern food truck line forming at lunchtime, remember, they didn't invent the idea. They just upgraded it. Long before wheels and logos, medieval cooks were already ladling comfort from steaming pots, turning barley and hope into something that tasted like survival.
Meat on stick stalls at fairs. Before there were kebabs sizzling on street corners, there were medieval fairs where people walked around gnawing meat off sticks like hungry pilgrims at a barbecue. Medieval fairs were the closest thing Europe had to a music festival. Except instead of bands and merch tents, you got jugglers, fire eaters, pickpockets, and a whole lot of roasting meat. Travelers came from miles around for trade and entertainment, but what really drew crowds was the smell. Smoke, fat, and spice filled the air as vendors turned skewers over open fires, selling meat on sticks to anyone with a coin and an appetite. These stalls were the ancestors of every kebab shop, sauté cart, and street grill we know today. The setup was primitive, but genius. Cooks would take small cuts of meat, usually lamb, beef, or game, thread them onto sharpened twigs or iron rods, and roast them over glowing coals. No plates, no bowls, no knives needed. You could eat with one hand while playing dice or clapping for a juggler with the other. Fast, portable, and smoky, it was the ultimate fair food. Medieval Europe borrowed the idea from the East. Crusaders returning from the Middle East in the 11th and 12th centuries brought home tales of seasoned skewers cooked over flames, what Arabic cooks called shish kebab. Europeans adapted it to their own meats and fuels. Where spices like cumin or coriander were rare, cooks improvised with garlic, salt, and a drizzle of vinegar or ale. In coastal towns, you might even get skewered fish or eels. The technique spread fast because it made economic sense. Small bites, minimal waste, maximum flavor. At fairs, these vendors were everywhere. You'd hear the hiss of dripping fat and see sparks flying as sticks rotated by hand or balanced across iron bars. The smell must have been irresistible. Imagine a mix of campfire, roast meat, and beer. People stood shoulder to shoulder, juggling coins and meat skewers, while minstrels played. It was chaotic, loud, and glorious. Of course, quality control wasn't exactly Michelin level. Some vendors used meat that had been hanging out in the sun a little too long, disguising the funk with heavy smoke. Others mixed cheaper cuts with breadcrumbs or organ meat to stretch a profit. But no one cared much. A hot, greasy bite of grilled lamb beat another bowl of cold barley porridge any day. And fairs weren't just for eating. They were social explosions. Dancing, games, gossip, and deals all happening while smoke curled into the sky. The smell of roasting meat became part of the sensory signature of medieval life. So next time you bite into a kebab after midnight, think of the fairgrounds 7 centuries ago. Crowds roaring, torches blazing, and vendors shouting, "Hot meat, fresh off the fire!" The kebab didn't start in a hit food stall. It started in a muddy medieval fair, where a wooden stick and a fire were all you needed to turn hunger into happiness.
Traveling fishmongers with salted or pickled herring. Forget ice trucks or refrigeration. In the Middle Ages, if you wanted seafood inland, it came by horse, smelling like salt and sea, carried by a traveling fishmonger, shouting, "Fresh herring!" halfway across the countryside. In the medieval world, fresh fish was a luxury that vanished fast. Without ice, even the finest catch turned foul within a day. So clever traders figured out a way to bring the sea to landlocked towns, salt it, pickle it, and send it traveling. Thus, the wandering fishmonger was born, a moving seafood delivery system centuries before trucks or freezers existed. These fishmongers were easy to spot. Picture a man or woman trudging along a muddy road with a handcart or a mule-drawn wagon loaded with barrels. The barrels weren't filled with ale. They sloshed with brine and tightly packed fish, usually herring. Salted or pickled, these silver fish became one of the most traded foods in medieval Europe. They were cheap, long-lasting, and could feed a household for weeks. Herring was the medieval version of canned tuna, reliable, affordable, and everywhere. During Lent and fasting days, when meat was banned, fish was the go-to protein. The church calendar practically guaranteed a booming fish trade. Roughly 1/3 of the year was fish only. That meant towns far from the ocean depended on fishmongers who traveled hundreds of miles to sell preserved seafood. The process was brilliant for its time. Fresh herring was gutted, layered in coarse salt in tightly packed barrels right on the docks. Sometimes it was smoked or soaked in vinegar brine with spices, an early form of pickling that kept it edible for months. These barrels were then sealed and hauled across rivers, mountains, and borders. By the time they reached inland markets, the fish had absorbed the salt so deeply it was almost mummified, tough but edible once rehydrated. Fishmongers often became local celebrities, arriving in towns with cries like, "Fine herrings, straight from the sea!" Their arrival meant the start of a feast or a holy season. People lined up with pots or baskets, bartering coins, grain, or even eggs for a few slippery fillets. In cities like London and Bruges, fishmongers formed powerful guilds, controlling prices and quality, a medieval version of the seafood union. Some grew rich enough to own ships, while others just walked from town to town, smelling perpetually of salt and brine. Not all fishmongers were saints, though. Some thinned their brine to save salt, causing their goods to rot mid-journey. Others topped off barrels with river fish and sold them as North Sea herring. Complaints about bad fish appear in city records as often as complaints about bad ale, proving that fake food scandals are nothing new. Still, salted and pickled herring was a cornerstone of medieval survival. It bridged geography, faith, and hunger, feeding monks, nobles, and peasants alike. So next time you open a can of sardines or see pickled herring on a deli shelf, remember that it once arrived by donkey, wrapped in brine and hope. Those traveling fishmongers didn't just sell seafood, they carried the ocean inland, one barrel at a time.
Pancake or fritter stalls near churches on feast days. If you'd walked out of a medieval church after Sunday Mass, you wouldn't have found a donut shop. You'd have found sizzling pans of batter outside the gates, flipping pancakes for saints and sinners alike. For all the gloom people imagined about the Middle Ages, plagues, sermons, and mud, there were also moments of real joy, and many of them smelled like fried batter. On feast days, when bells rang and people poured out of churches dressed in their best wool and linen, vendors were already waiting. Their stalls smoked with hot oil, bubbling batter and sugar crusting in the air. Medieval Europe didn't have cafes, but outside almost every cathedral, abbey, or chapel, there'd be someone cooking pancakes and fritters for the crowd. These stalls were the unofficial food courts of holy days. When fasting ended or a saint's feast began, everyone celebrated with food, not heavy roasts, but small festive treats. Pancakes and fritters were perfect, cheap, fast to make, and portable. The vendor would set up a brazier or shallow iron pan over coals, ladle out batter made from flour, milk, eggs, and ale. Yes, ale. Yeast and bubbles came from beer. And flip it with a wooden stick. Some versions were sprinkled with honey or cinnamon if the customer could afford it. Others got bits of apple or dried fruit mixed in. You could eat it hot in your hand while gossiping about who fell asleep during Mass. Churches attracted everyone. Merchants, farmers, beggars, pilgrims, and feast days turned quiet courtyards into temporary carnivals. Musicians played, children ran wild, and somewhere between the prayers and the pudding, the line between sacred and social blurred. Vendors knew it was their best business day. Some even planned their year around the church calendar, traveling from town to town, setting up stalls wherever a feast was declared. There was symbolism in the foods, too. Fried batter represented indulgence, a rare treat after periods of fasting. During Carnival, right before Lent, pancake sellers made a fortune as people used up all their forbidden ingredients: milk, eggs, butter. Better to eat them in golden circles of joy than let them go to waste. Medieval cooks even called it Shrovetide frying, a ritual farewell to rich food before 40 days of fish and vegetables. Not everyone approved, of course. Monks and preachers sometimes scolded the crowds for turning holy days into street fairs.
Chroniclers complained that the people think more on fritters than on faith. But the truth was simple. After long prayers and long hunger, a hot pancake was divine. So next time you pass a church fundraiser selling baked goods or a food stall outside a festival, you're seeing a tradition older than coffee shops themselves. Long before brunch was a word, the faithful were celebrating with fritters on the street, batter sizzling, bells ringing, laughter rising to the steeple. For a few sweet moments, holiness smelled like fried dough.
Ale cellars offering small beer. If you lived in medieval Europe and wanted something safe to drink, you didn't reach for water. You reached for beer. And yes, even kids drank it. In a world without modern plumbing or pasteurization, clean water was basically a gamble with your life. Rivers doubled as garbage dumps, and wells were questionable at best. So medieval people did something brilliantly practical. They boiled their water with grain and called it beer. But not the strong kind that gets you singing on tables. This was small beer, the medieval version of a soft drink. Small beer was brewed from the leftover mash after stronger ale had been made. The grains were reused, meaning the result had less alcohol, usually 1 to 2%, but enough to kill bacteria. It was mild, slightly sweet, sometimes sour, and safer than any water you could find. People drank it from breakfast to bedtime. Workers, nuns, nobles, even toddlers. A pint of small beer was considered nourishment, not a vice. It gave calories, hydration, and a bit of buzz, but not enough to send you stumbling into the street. Ale cellars, often women called alewives, were the lifeblood of every town. You'd spot them by the broomstick or ale pole hanging outside their homes, a sign that fresh brew was ready. Their businesses were half kitchen, half neighborhood hangout. Locals came by for a quick jug to take to work or to sit and talk while sipping something cool. They didn't serve fancy glass pints or foamy mugs. Drinks came in wooden tankards, ceramic jugs, or straight from the bucket if you brought your own cup. Selling ale was one of the few trades open to women, and some became quite successful. City records mention widows who brewed barrels of small beer each week, selling to markets, taverns, and construction sites. For big projects, like cathedral building, brewers delivered fresh small beer daily to keep laborers hydrated. In a sense, these women were running the first beverage delivery services centuries before soda trucks. Small beer was more than a drink. It was part of the rhythm of life. Children drank it with breakfast. Monks brewed it in monasteries for pilgrims. Farmers carried it in leather flasks to the fields. It was so normal that beer money was part of wages. In some places, households brewed their own batches weekly, filling the village with that warm, malty smell that meant safety and sustenance. Of course, not all ale cellars were saints. Some watered down their brew too much, or added herbs to fake freshness. Dishonest brewers could be fined or forced to dump their barrels in public, but the demand never stopped. So next time you open a soda or grab an energy drink, imagine a medieval laborer wiping sweat from his brow, raising a jug of small beer, and saying the same thing you do after a long day. Ah, that hits the spot. It wasn't just beer. It was survival in a cup, one sip at a time. Apple fritters and sweet wafers sold after Mass. You know that feeling when you leave church and immediately smell something delicious outside? Turns out medieval people felt the exact same thing. Except instead of coffee and donuts, it was sizzling apple fritters and crispy wafers. For most medieval townsfolk, Sunday wasn't complete without food. After sitting through a long, incense-filled mass in cold stone churches with no pew cushions, everyone poured out hungry. Waiting right outside were vendors who knew exactly how to catch that post-sermon crowd: hot apple fritters and delicate sweet wafers. They were the unofficial reward for being good. The fritters were irresistible. Imagine chunks of apple dipped in spiced batter, sometimes flavored with ale, cinnamon, or nutmeg, then dropped into hot oil until golden. The smell alone could make a monk break his fast. Vendors flipped them on portable braziers, dusted them with sugar or honey, and sold them by the handful. You could walk home munching one straight off a wooden skewer, still warm, the sugar melting on your fingers. Wafers were the other crowd favorite. Thin, crispy, and pressed between iron plates with decorative patterns, crosses, flowers, or even saints, they were snack and souvenir. Some wafers were purely sweet, made from flour, sugar, and eggs. Others had a hint of spice or almond. They were the medieval version of a cookie, light, fancy, and perfect for special days. And yes, the same kind of wafer irons were also used to make communion wafers. So in a funny way, church and dessert shared the same tools. These post-Mass vendors were clever entrepreneurs. They didn't need storefronts, just a brazier, a stool, and a good location. Churches were the medieval equivalent of high traffic zones, so right after Mass, the area turned into a mini market. Kids begged parents for fritters, friends chatted over wafers, and travelers picked up snacks before hitting the road. It was social, noisy, and filled with laughter, a little rebellion against the solemnity inside the church. And while we think of medieval food as gray and grim, these treats show the sweeter side of daily life. Honey and sugar were expensive, but people splurged on feast days or Sundays. Apple fritters in particular had cultural weight. They appeared in medieval cookbooks like The Form of Curry from the 14th century England, proving they weren't just street snacks, but beloved across classes. Even kings ate versions of them, just plated with more elegance and gold leaf instead of sticky fingers. Church officials didn't always approve of the festive atmosphere outside their doors. Some sermons warned against idle eating and chatter after worship. But the truth is, food was part of how people celebrated faith. It brought the sacred back to earth, literally. So, next time you walk out of a service and smell pastries or coffee brewing nearby, you're living out a 1,000-year-old tradition. The medieval faithful did the same thing, shaking off solemnity with sugar, laughter, and the simple joy of a warm apple fritter.
Sausage vendors at city gates feeding travelers. Before there were gas stations and drive-thrus, medieval travelers stopped at city gates. And instead of coffee and hot dogs, they got, well, actual hot dogs. Every major medieval city had one thing in common: gates. These were the checkpoints of the world, guarded archways that separated the wild countryside from the crowded safety of town. But to a weary traveler on horseback or foot, those gates meant something else entirely: food. Right where the road met the wall, smoke drifted from open grills and sizzling pans. Sausage vendors set up shop there, feeding hungry wanderers long before anyone coined the term fast food. Picture it.
You've been walking for days through rain and mud. Your boots are falling apart, and all you want is something hot. As soon as the gate towers come into view, you smell spiced pork hitting a hot pan. The vendor, usually a burly man or woman in a soot-streaked apron, is already shouting, "Hot sausage, fresh and fat?" Travelers, merchants, and guards gather around, paying a few coins for links of meat wrapped in bread or leaves. Simple, smoky, and satisfying. Medieval sausages were as practical as they were delicious. They were made from whatever cuts were available, pork, beef, venison, or even offal, chopped, salted, mixed with herbs, and stuffed into intestines. Salt was the key ingredient. It kept the meat from spoiling during travel. Some sausages were pre-cooked and smoked so they could be eaten cold on the road. Others were fried or roasted on the spot, dripping grease into the fire as travelers tore into them. The city gate was the perfect place for this trade. Everyone coming or going passed through, from pilgrims to soldiers to peddlers. Inside the walls, food was taxed or regulated by guilds, but just outside, vendors could sell freely, the medieval equivalent of operating just beyond the city limits to dodge inspection fees. It was where commerce met convenience. These sausage stalls also became gathering spots. Guards on duty grabbed quick bites between shifts. Merchants haggled over prices while chewing. Musicians played for tips. At night, when torches flickered and the gates closed, the vendors stayed, feeding stragglers who arrived too late to enter the city. For a few coins, you could get a warm meal, a place by the fire, and maybe some gossip about the road ahead. Of course, not every sausage was a masterpiece. Some were mostly fat and breadcrumbs. Others had mystery meat you didn't want to ask about. Still, after a week of dry bread and cold air, that first bite of smoky, salty sausage must have felt like a small miracle. So next time you stop for a late-night hot dog or a quick snap at a gas station, remember, people have been doing the same thing for nearly 1,000 years. Long before fast food chains or diners, the smell of sizzling meat at a city gate was the universal sign that civilization and dinner was finally within reach. Soup wives carrying kettles door to door, selling hot broth. DoorDash didn't invent food delivery. Medieval soup wives were walking around with boiling kettles centuries before apps or tips even existed. In the bustling back streets of medieval cities, before restaurants or takeout menus, there was one sound that told everyone dinner was near. The clang of a metal ladle against a pot, and a voice shouting, "Hot soup! Hot broth for sale!" Those voices belonged to the soup wives, women who carried kettles of steaming pottage door to door, feeding entire neighborhoods one ladle at a time. These weren't noble women or trained cooks. Most soup wives were widows, servants, or working-class wives trying to earn a few coins between tending children and washing clothes. They'd wake before dawn, visit local butchers or markets, and collect bones, vegetable scraps, and leftover grains, whatever they could afford or beg for. Then, over a smoky hearth, they'd boil everything into a thick, fragrant broth that could stretch for hours. By morning, it was ready to sell. Armed with iron pots wrapped in cloth and a sturdy handle, they set out through the streets, kettles swinging, steam rising, voices echoing through alleyways. They sold by the bowl, ladling hot soup into whatever container a customer had, a wooden bowl, a hunk of bread, or even cupped hands if you were desperate. It was fast, cheap, and warm. 3 words that defined survival in a medieval city. The soup wife became a familiar figure, part vendor, part neighbor, part gossip hub. She knew who was sick, who was broke, who'd had a baby, and who was sneaking off with the baker's apprentice. People trusted her because she showed up every day, rain or shine, with something nourishing. In the cold months, her arrival could literally save lives. Broth was one of the few foods that even the toothless or weak could eat, and it delivered hydration, fat, and salt, the essentials when meat was a luxury. City records and old ballads actually mention them. In London and Paris, soup wives or pottage sellers were sometimes licensed by the city, allowed to set up small stalls near busy streets or hospitals. But most worked informally, walking from door to door until their pots were empty. At the end of the day, they'd scrub the kettle, save the broth dregs, and start over the next morning. Of course, there were complaints. Some people accused them of watering down their soup or reusing bones too many times. But for the poorest families, a thin broth was still better than none. It was nourishment and kindness ladled together. In a way, these women were the heartbeat of medieval street food. Mobile chefs, healers, and entrepreneurs. They didn't need a kitchen or a cart, just a pot, a fire, and the will to feed their neighbors. So next time you grab soup to go or order delivery on a rainy day, think back to those women trudging through cobbled streets, balancing a steaming kettle, calling out, "Hot broth! Warm your bones!" They were the original delivery drivers, and every bit as vital.
Pea pottage ladled into clay bowls for pennies. Before anyone thought of split pea soup as comfort food, medieval folks thought of it as fuel, thick, green, and served from a steaming pot on the street for the price of a single penny. If you had only a few coins in your pocket in medieval Europe, you weren't dreaming of roast meat or fancy pies. You were hoping for a bowl of pea pottage. It wasn't pretty, but it kept you alive. A humble, bubbling mixture of peas, onions, and herbs, thick enough to stand a spoon in. Sold from cauldrons in markets or tavern doorways, it was the most common street meal in Europe for centuries, the true penny dinner. Pea pottage was more than food. It was the great equalizer. Nobles might eat venison and saffron rice, but everyone, from monks to beggars, knew the taste of pottage. Vendors cooked it in huge iron pots that simmered all day, refilled constantly with water, peas, and whatever scraps were around. If you passed a stall, you'd see clay bowls lined up on a plank table, steam curling in the cold air, the smell earthy and comforting. For a single penny, you got a ladleful. No garnish, no flair. Just warmth and protein in a bowl. The secret was the dried pea. It was cheap, easy to store, and packed with nutrients, a working man's miracle food. Cooks soaked them overnight, boiled them for hours until they turned soft and thick, and often added leeks, garlic, or bits of ham fat when available. The result was a meal that stuck to your ribs and could feed a crowd from one pot. And because it could be kept simmering all day without spoiling, it was perfect for street vendors,
the medieval version of always hot and ready. For the poor, pea pottage wasn't just lunch, it was life. In cities like London or Bruges, workers lined up for it at dawn before heading to the fields or workshops. Hospitals and monasteries served it daily to the sick and hungry. Records even show soldiers being paid partly in peas because the army could live on them for months. It's not glamorous, but if you were cold, tired, or broke, that green mush in a clay bowl was the difference between hunger and survival. Of course, not everyone loved it. Satirical writers of the time mocked it as beggar's glue, a dish that sticks to the pot and to your bones. But it was endlessly adaptable. Some versions were thin and soupy, others so thick you could slice it. Families often saved the leftover pottage overnight, fried it into patties the next day, and started the next pot with what remained. Nothing wasted. Everything recycled. So the next time you see pea soup on a cafe menu, think of it not as quaint, but revolutionary. For medieval people, it was fast, filling, and affordable. The street food that kept whole cities running. One pot, 1 penny, one warm bowl at a time.
Milkmaids selling fresh milk directly from buckets at dawn. The city's still asleep, mist hugging the cobblestones, when a soft voice cuts through the quiet. "Milk! Fresh milk!" And just like that, the medieval morning begins. Long before the day truly started, milkmaids were already working. They were the dawn shift lifeline of every medieval town. Young women balancing wooden yokes across their shoulders, 2 heavy buckets swinging at their sides, each one filled with milk so fresh it was still warm from the cow. They walked through narrow streets in the gray light of morning, calling out to sleepy households and shopkeepers, their voices carrying like song. In a time before refrigeration, before bottles, even before proper markets, this was how milk reached people's tables. By foot, 1 bucket at a time. These women rose before sunrise to milk their cows, strain the liquid through cloth to remove stray hairs or straw, and set off toward town before the first church bell rang. Customers waited with clay jugs or pewter cups, and the milkmaid poured straight from her bucket, measuring by eye and memory, not by scale or coin weight, but by trust. The milk itself was a rare treat. Most medieval people drank ale, water being too risky and wine too expensive. Fresh milk was short-lived. It soured quickly, especially in summer. But for those lucky enough to buy it, it was a taste of comfort and nourishment. Children, the sick, and the elderly all relied on the milkmaids who appeared like clockwork every dawn. They were easy to recognize, not just by their buckets, but by their songs. Many milkmaids sang as they walked, partly to attract customers, partly to stay awake after sleepless nights. Chroniclers described their voices as merry and bright, saying the sound of a milkmaid's call meant the sun would soon follow. But behind that charm was exhaustion. Each bucket could weigh over 40 pounds, and every step through muddy streets was work. Spilling a single pail meant losing half a day's income.
Still, they were proud of what they did. Milkmaids were among the few women who ran their own small businesses. Some worked for farms or monasteries. Others bought milk wholesale to resell in town. Their income depended entirely on their reputation. If you watered down your milk or sold a sour batch, the gossip spread faster than the smell. Cities like London eventually required milkmaids to sell in public markets where the quality could be checked. But many loyal customers still preferred the familiar face who came knocking each morning. By the time the rest of the city began its day, bakers shouting, smiths hammering, merchants setting up stalls, the milkmaids were heading home, their buckets empty, their feet blistered, and their earnings jingling faintly in their aprons. They had already seen the sunrise, fed a dozen households, and delivered something pure in a world that didn't always have much purity to spare. So next time you pour milk into your coffee or cereal, picture that quiet figure walking through a mist, singing softly as the first light hits her shoulders. She was the original morning delivery. No horse, no cart, just grit, grace, and 2 buckets of life.
Meat pies stuffed with pigeon, rabbit, or eel. Ever bite into something delicious without wanting to ask what's inside? In medieval times, that was practically the rule, because your meat pie might have been pigeon, rabbit, or eel. Walk through any medieval market, and you'd smell it before you saw it. The buttery, meaty aroma of pies baking in stone ovens, steam puffing through little slits on top like chimneys. These were the medieval equivalent of fast food staples. Meat pies sold by street vendors and taverns, hot, filling, and perfectly portable. But the ingredients depended on what you could catch, trap, or buy cheap that week, which meant your meat pie might not contain what you expected. Pigeon was the go-to filling for the middle class. City rooftops were full of dovecotes, wooden bird houses that provided a constant source of fresh meat. Rabbits came next. Easy to breed, easy to stew, and mild enough to mix with herbs or onions. But the real curveball was eel. Medieval people loved eel. It was meaty, rich, and didn't count as meat on church fasting days, which made it a loophole protein. Cooks diced it up, seasoned it with nutmeg or saffron, and tucked it under a thick crust that was sealed in the juices. These pies weren't dainty pastries. They were small, rugged meals made to survive travel. The crusts were tough, more like containers than food, baked hard to keep the filling safe for days. Workers carried them to the fields, travelers packed them for the road, and merchants sold them to crowds at fairs. The idea was simple. A full meal you could hold in one hand. No utensils, no cleanup, no waste. Inside, though, was a small miracle of resourcefulness. Salted rabbit might mingle with dried fruit for sweetness. Pigeon fat would keep the filling moist. Eel, with its oily texture, worked like natural butter. Spices like pepper, cinnamon, or cloves, once expensive imports, showed off wealth when sprinkled on top. Even poor cooks knew tricks to stretch flavor, using ale instead of water for gravy, or tossing in breadcrumbs to thicken it. And since pies could hide anything, not every one was trustworthy. Some vendors used spoiled meat, masking the smell with heavy spice.
Laws eventually required that sellers mark what kind of meat they used, though mystery pie jokes still filled taverns for centuries. The pies were so popular that pie men became fixtures in cities, carrying trays around their necks and shouting rhymes to advertise their wares. In wealthier homes, the same idea turned extravagant. Cooks baked giant coffin pies stuffed with multiple animals, rabbits inside pigeons, pigeons inside geese, a culinary matryoshka doll meant to impress dinner guests. But for most people, a small hand-sized pie from a market stall was as comforting as food got, hot, savory, and wrapped in its own edible shell. So the next time you grab a meat pie or hand pie at a bakery, remember the centuries of ingenuity behind it. Each bite is a story of survival and a silent gamble about what might be hiding under that golden crust. Cold cuts of salted pork or beef served on bread. No microwaves, no fridges, no problem. When medieval people wanted a quick, ready-to-eat meal, they reached for the original cold-cut sandwich, slices of salted meat on hard bread. For most of history, leftovers weren't something you reheated. They were something you survived on. In the Middle Ages, meat didn't stay fresh for long, so cooks learned to preserve it with salt. The result was tough, briny pork or beef that could last for weeks and travel for miles. It wasn't fancy, but it was dependable. And when hunger hit, all you had to do was slice off a few pieces, slap them on a chunk of bread, and you had yourself the medieval version of a quick lunch. Salted meat was everywhere. Armies marched on it, sailors lived on it, and peasants kept it hanging in their kitchens through the winter. The process was simple. Butcher the animal, rub the meat with salt, sometimes mixed with herbs or ash, and hang it to dry in a cool, smoky place. The salt pulled out moisture and stopped bacteria, turning meat into a kind of edible time capsule. When the craving struck, you could shave off thin pieces, soak them in water to remove the salt, or just eat them as is if your teeth were strong enough. And then came the bread, the universal plate, napkin, and utensil of the medieval world. It wasn't soft or fluffy like modern loaves. It was dense, dry, and sturdy enough to hold meat without crumbling. Workers and travelers used it like a cutting board. Some poured ale over it to soften it before eating. Others piled meat on top and called it a meal. In busy towns, vendors even sold bread and beef portions ready to go, the early ancestors of deli counters. For city folk, this was the perfect street food. No fire, no spoons, no bowls, just a quick bite you could eat while walking. But salted meat had its quirks. It was so preserved that it sometimes had to be beaten with a hammer or soaked overnight to be chewable. Sailors joked that salted beef could break your jaw before it filled your stomach. Still, when paired with bread and ale, it became satisfying, the kind of humble meal that powered centuries of laborers. Salted meat also shaped medieval trade. Vast quantities of pork and beef were shipped across Europe, especially from places like Ireland and the Baltic, where salt was cheap and plentiful. Whole economies thrived on it, and the smell of curing meat, smoky, sharp, a little sour, was the scent of survival in every season. So, when you unwrap a ham sandwich or grab a bit of jerky, you're tasting a piece of the past. Medieval workers didn't call it charcuterie, but that's exactly what it was. Simple, preserved, and portable. For them, salted meat on bread wasn't a picnic snack. It was proof that even in a world without refrigeration, people had already mastered the art of lunch on the go. Sops, chunks of bread soaked in broth or wine. Ever eaten something so simple it feels ancient? Sops were just that, chunks of bread soaked in broth or wine, a meal so basic and comforting that fed everyone from peasants to kings. Before spoons became standard and bowls were common, medieval people had a different way of eating. They didn't sip it, they soaked it. The word sop comes from the Old French soup or soupe, meaning to soak or steep. At its core, it was bread used as a sponge for something tastier, broth, gravy, wine, or even ale. It was the edible middle ground between a meal and a utensil, the original one-dish dinner. Sops appeared everywhere. At grand banquets, servers placed toasted bread at the bottom of a bowl and poured spiced wine or rich stew over it. Nobles ate theirs with roasted duck or beef gravy dripping down. In taverns and homes, poorer folk did the same thing, just with thinner broth, cabbage soup, or whatever was left over from last night's pot. It was practical, filling, and required no plates, no forks, and no waste. The bread acted like today's pasta or rice, a carb base that made a small amount of meat or liquid feel like a feast. You could take a stale loaf that was too hard to chew and revive it with a splash of hot liquid. Nothing was wasted. Medieval cookbooks even gave recipes for fancy versions. Sops with almond milk and cinnamon, or honeyed wine for dessert. For sick or elderly people, doctors prescribed sops as gentle food, easy to digest, soft, and comforting. Sops also carried a social meaning. Sharing sops with someone, dipping bread in the same bowl, was an act of closeness. At the Last Supper in Christian art, Christ is often shown offering a sop to Judas, a gesture that turned from intimate to ominous. In daily life, however, it was common for friends or families to eat from the same pot, tearing bread together and soaking it in the same stew. Food was communal, not individual, and sops symbolized that bond. You'd find sops in every setting, from taverns full of workers to monasteries feeding dozens of monks in silence. In some inns, the first course was literally just broth and sops, a bowl of steaming liquid with bits of bread floating inside. Simple, cheap, and fast to serve. And when travelers couldn't afford a meal, innkeepers might hand out leftover sops soaked in watered-down wine, enough to fill the stomach and keep spirits up. Over time, the humble sop evolved. As tableware spread, people began serving the liquid separately, what we now call soup. The word itself survived in that shift. So when you sip soup today, you're echoing a medieval practice that started with bread and broth. For medieval diners, the sop was more than food. It was warmth, thrift, and togetherness in one bowl. Just bread, just broth, and a reminder that sometimes the simplest meals are the ones that never die. Pickled onions, radishes, or beets as side snacks. If medieval fast food had a side dish, it wasn't fries, it was pickles. Tangy onions, spicy radishes, and earthy beets soaked in vinegar were the bite-sized snacks that kept every meal alive. Medieval people understood something modern diners sometimes forget. When your main food is heavy, you need something sharp to cut through it. That's where pickled vegetables came in. Salted, soaked, and steeped in vinegar or brine, they were the zesty side dish of their world. Cheap, long-lasting, and full of flavor when everything else on your plate was brown. The Middle Ages didn't have refrigeration, so pickling was survival. Farmers, merchants, and tavern owners preserved vegetables in barrels or jars. Onions, radishes, and beets were the favorites because they were easy to grow and held up well in the cold. People sliced them thin, packed them in salt, then poured over vinegar made from wine or ale. Sometimes they added spices like mustard seed, cloves, or peppercorns. Expensive, yes, but worth the punch they added. The result? Crunchy, sour, spicy snacks that could brighten even the dullest porridge. You might find pickled onions served with roast beef, radishes on a bread trencher, or beets sold by street vendors in small clay cups. In busy markets, you could buy a handful of pickled vegetables from a stall, eating them as you walked, the medieval version of grab-and-go sides. For poor households, pickles were more than condiments. They were health insurance. Vinegar preserved food that might otherwise rot, and the acidity helped mask the taste of meat that had gone slightly off. Peasants ate pickled vegetables all winter when fresh produce was scarce. They were sharp, filling, and easy to store, a burst of flavor in a season of blandness. Meanwhile, the wealthy treated pickles as refined delicacies. Medieval cookbooks describe elaborate, sour salads served between meat courses to cleanse the palate. Bright colors mattered too. Red beets and pink onions were displayed as edible jewels on noble tables. Some royal kitchens even imported lemons or olives to pickle, turning a peasant's preservation method into high cuisine. In taverns, pickled sides were essential drinking companions. A bite of sour onion between gulps of ale kept customers coming back, the same principle behind modern pub snacks. And just like today, there was no one recipe. Every region, and even every family, had its own mix of spices and vinegar. In coastal areas, seawater brine replaced wine vinegar. Inland, people used malt vinegar made from beer. Pickled vegetables also carried a touch of medicine. Medieval doctors swore vinegar cut through melancholy and cleared the humors. Maybe it didn't cure the plague, but it certainly cured boredom at the dinner table. So the next time you bite into a crisp pickle or see a jar of pickled beets at a market, remember, that tangy tradition has been brightening heavy meals for nearly 1,000 years. Medieval diners may not have had fries with their pies, but they had something else just as satisfying. A bite of sour joy to wake up the taste buds and make every meal feel a little more alive. Pottage, the universal stew that changed daily depending on scraps. Ask a medieval person what they had for dinner, and 9 times out of 10 the answer was the same. Pottage. The twist? It never tasted the same twice. If there was one dish that united every class of medieval society, from peasants in muddy huts to monks in echoing abbeys, it was pottage. Not quite soup, not quite stew. It was a thick, bubbling cauldron of whatever ingredients life had handed you that day. The word came from the old French potage, literally meaning what's in the pot. And that's exactly how it worked. It was survival cooking at its finest, endlessly flexible, perpetually simmering, and never the same from one day to the next. A pot of pottage sat over the fire in nearly every home, rich or poor. Into it went anything edible, grains like barley or oats, chopped vegetables, herbs, bits of meat if you could spare them, and the occasional surprise, like dried fruit or ale. The fire never went out, and neither did the pot. Each morning, more water and ingredients were added, creating what historians call perpetual stew. The flavor deepened over days or even weeks as yesterday's leftovers became the base for tomorrow's meal. For peasants, pottage was the cornerstone of survival. It used cheap ingredients that filled the belly: beans, leeks, onions, cabbage, peas, simmered until soft enough to eat with stale bread. Meat was rare, but a scrap of bacon rind or a bone could flavor the whole pot. You didn't need to measure or plan. You just cooked what you had. That made it ideal for a world where food security changed with the weather. In wealthier households, pottage became art. Cooks turned it into delicate broths, scented with saffron or cinnamon, adding almonds, chicken, or fish for the upper classes. Some royal recipes even mention golden pottage, breadcrumbs thickened with egg yolks and gilded with real gold leaf to impress guests. So while the poor boiled weeds, the rich boiled extravagance. But the pot was still the same. The beauty of pottage was its constancy. It was the flavor of daily life. You could walk through a medieval town and smell it everywhere, 1,000 variations of the same humble stew. Some historians joke that the real scent of the Middle Ages wasn't wood smoke or ale, but simmering pottage mixed with smoke and salt. It was also practical in every way. Cooking one pot saved fuel, cleaning, and time. It was soft enough for children and elders, nourishing enough for workers, and forgiving enough that nothing ever went to waste. Even when times were desperate, people found comfort in the ritual of stirring that pot, watching the bubbles rise, and knowing they'd get at least something warm to eat. So next time you make soup from leftovers or stretch last night's stew, you're keeping a 1,000-year-old habit alive. Medieval people didn't invent meal prep or slow cooking. They just never stopped doing it. One pot, endless variations, and a taste of home in every ladle.
Baked apples with honey, medieval dessert to go. Sweet cravings aren't new. Centuries before chocolate bars or cupcakes, medieval people satisfied their sweet tooth with something simple, warm, and golden,
baked apples drizzled with honey. Dessert in the Middle Ages wasn't about layers of frosting or sugar sculptures. It was about warmth, fragrance, and comfort. And the simplest indulgence of all was a baked apple. For both peasants and nobles, it was the closest thing to a sweet treat you could carry in your hand. Vendors sold them hot from ovens or street braziers, the skin wrinkled and caramelized, the inside soft as jam, and the honey melting into every bite. Apples were everywhere in Europe, easy to grow, easy to store, and central to both diet and myth. They were the fruit of choice for pies, tarts, cider, and snacks. In autumn, when orchards overflowed, towns smelled faintly of apples cooking. But it wasn't just about abundance, it was about transformation. With a bit of heat and honey, even a bruised apple became something worth savoring. Street vendors made fortunes selling them outside churches, fairs, and inns. They'd set up small ovens or metal pans over coals, roasting apples until their juices hissed. A touch of honey or syrup was drizzled over the top. Sugar was expensive and rare, so honey was the sweetener of the people. Sometimes cooks added spices like cinnamon, nutmeg, or clove for those who could afford them. The result was a portable dessert that fit perfectly in the palm of your hand, warm, fragrant, and easy to eat while walking home. For peasants, baked apples were a rare moment of luxury. They were cheap, filling, and smelled divine, an edible reward after a week of hard work. In taverns, they might be served with ale or warmed milk. In noble homes, they appeared on silver plates stuffed with almonds or raisins. But whether eaten from a gilded dish or a wooden bowl, the joy was the same. The sweetness cut through the salt and smoke of daily food, reminding people that life could still taste good. Medieval cooks even saw baked apples as medicine. Doctors of the time claimed they calmed the humors and soothed digestion. Honey, meanwhile, was considered a natural healer, antibacterial, energizing, and sacred. A baked apple wasn't just dessert, it was comfort food for the body and soul. And like all great street foods, it traveled. Wrapped in leaves or cloth, a baked apple could be carried for hours. Pilgrims, traders, and travelers often bought them as dessert to go, tucking them into satchels to eat later on the road. The scent alone, sweet, smoky, faintly floral, was enough to lift a weary mood. So next time you smell apples roasting or drizzle honey on something warm, you're part of a long, sticky, delicious history. In a world without sugar factories or chocolate shops, medieval people still found ways to make joy portable. Their recipe for happiness was simple. Take an apple, add heat, and let honey do the rest. Spiced wine as an after-meal drink. Dinner might have ended, but in the Middle Ages, the real treat came afterward, a cup of crimson wine laced with cinnamon, cloves, and sugar, known as hippocras. It was a dessert you could drink. When people pictured medieval feasts, they imagined roasted boars, silver goblets, and loud laughter. But there was always one final act to the show, the spiced wine. Known as Hippocras, it was the grand finale, the elegant goodbye, the sweet burn that left everyone smiling. Served warm or cold, it wasn't just a drink. It was a statement of sophistication, wealth, and a little bit of magic. The name Hippocras came from Hippocrates, the ancient Greek physician, not because he invented it, but because the wine was strained through a Hippocrates sleeve, a cloth filter shaped like a cone, originally used for medicine. That's fitting because in the medieval mind, food and health were the same thing. People believed spiced wine balanced the humors and aided digestion. So after a heavy meal of meat and bread, hosts poured it as both a luxury and a cure. The recipe changed from country to country, but the essentials were always the same. Red or white wine, mixed with honey or sugar, if you could afford it, and an intoxicating blend of spices like cinnamon, ginger, cloves, nutmeg, and grains of paradise, a peppery seed prized for its heat. The result was fragrant, sweet, and heady, something between mulled wine and perfume. In an age before toothpaste, it also did wonders for post-feast breath. For nobles, Hippocras was the mark of refinement. You didn't just serve wine, you crafted it. The richer your spice mix, the more impressive you looked. Spices were expensive, imported from across the world by merchants who risked their lives for nutmeg and clove. To offer guests Hippocras was to literally pour your wealth into a cup. At royal banquets, servers brought it out in ornate jugs engraved with vines or mythical beasts, and guests toasted to good health, long life, and safe digestion. But it wasn't just for kings. Tavern keepers and market vendors sold cheaper versions to travelers and townsfolk, thinner wine, fewer spices, more sugar. Some even used ale instead of wine, calling it poor man's Hippocras. It was still warm, still spiced, and still comforting. The medieval equivalent of grabbing a mulled cider on a cold night. Doctors and monks swore by it. Recipes appear in medical manuscripts right alongside herbal remedies. They claimed it purged phlegm and warmed the stomach. Whether or not it healed anyone, it certainly made people feel better about life. And that's a kind of medicine, too. So the next time you sip mulled wine at Christmas or a spiced cocktail by candlelight, raise a glass to the people who did it first. For medieval diners, Hippocras wasn't just about taste. It was about warmth, celebration, and the sweet satisfaction that came after a feast. One sip, and you'd know. The meal may have ended, but the night had just begun. Portable boiled eggs sold on skewers. Quick protein on the go? Medieval people had it figured out. Not in plastic packs or deli shelves, but on wooden sticks. Street vendors sold boiled eggs on skewers. And yes, they were basically the original grab-and-go snack. Picture a medieval market square at sunrise. The air smells of smoke and bread. Vendors are shouting prices. And a woman walks by carrying a tray lined with brown-shelled eggs, each one peeled, glistening, and skewered 3 at a time on a stick. She's selling boiled eggs,
the simplest, cleanest fast food imaginable. You hand her a coin, take a stick, sprinkle a bit of salt if you're lucky, and walk off to start your day. No plate, no mess, no waiting. Eggs were the miracle food of the Middle Ages. They were cheap, packed with energy, and available to almost everyone. Farmers had hens, monasteries raised chickens by the dozens, and even city households kept small coops. But boiled eggs were special because they traveled well. No cooking fire needed, no tools required. Vendors could boil them in the morning, load them into baskets or wooden trays, and sell them all day. The hard shell acted as packaging, long before anyone invented paper wraps. The egg skewer was simple but genius. Once peeled, eggs were stacked on small wooden sticks so customers could eat without touching the food directly. A thoughtful design in a world with questionable hygiene. Street vendors often walked through markets, inns, or city gates, shouting "hot eggs, warm and ready." If you were lucky enough to find a fresh batch, they'd still be warm from the pot. Salt was a prized companion, sold in tiny paper twists or from a communal pot at the stall. Some fancier versions came dusted with pepper or dipped in vinegar. Eggs also crossed class lines easily. Peasants grabbed them from the market, monks ate them on fasting days, and nobles served them sliced with herbs at breakfast. The same food fit every table. The only difference was the presentation. Medieval people loved symbolism, and eggs had plenty. They represented new life, purity, and the promise of spring. Churches even blessed eggs during Easter, and festivals featured decorated shells long before modern Easter eggs became a thing. But for most folks, symbolism stopped once hunger kicked in. It was just a fast, affordable meal that filled the stomach and fit in the hand. Sometimes vendors sold travel eggs, boiled until the yolk turned solid enough to last days without spoiling. Pilgrims and soldiers carried them wrapped in cloth as emergency rations. They were protein-dense, portable, and perfect for long roads where fresh food was rare. So next time you grab a protein snack at a cafe, remember, the medievals beat you to it. Centuries before energy bars or convenience stores, people were already walking the streets, munching boiled eggs on sticks, chatting about the day's news, and tossing the empty skewers into the mud. It was quick, cheap, and brilliantly simple. Proof that fast food doesn't need to be fancy. It just needs to work.
Fried cheese curds were the ancestor of cheese sticks. Crunchy on the outside, gooey in the middle. It sounds like bar food, right? But fried cheese isn't modern at all. Medieval cooks were dunking cheese curds in hot oil long before mozzarella sticks hit the fryer. Cheese was everywhere in the Middle Ages. It was one of the few foods that could be stored, traded, or carried for months without spoiling. A farmer's savings account made edible. But on feast days or market weekends, people didn't want practicality. They wanted indulgence. That's where fried cheese curds came in. It was a simple idea with dangerous appeal. Take something already good, coat it in batter or breadcrumbs, and fry it until golden and bubbling. This dish started in monasteries and noble kitchens, but quickly spread to towns and fairs. Medieval cooks had already mastered the art of deep frying. They fried fish, fritters, and dough. Cheese was a natural next step.
Fresh curds, or sometimes small cubes of aged cheese, were tossed in flour or crushed crumbs and then dropped into hot lard or oil. The result? Crispy outside, molten inside. Comfort food, centuries ahead of its time. The smell alone could stop people mid-stride. Markets filled with sizzling sounds, the air rich with the aroma of dairy and smoke. Vendors sold fried cheese by the handful, often wrapped in leaves or paper, still warm enough to sting your fingers. It was cheap, fast, and delicious. Everything street food should be. Workers on lunch breaks, travelers at inns, and even nobles in disguise at fairs would all queue up for a taste. But cheese meant more than flavor in medieval life. It was a symbol of abundance, turning milk, a fragile resource, into something long-lasting. Frying it was a kind of celebration. It showed you had enough oil or fat to waste on pleasure, not just necessity. Some versions even added spices like saffron or herbs, creating what early cookbooks called cheese fritters. The form of curry, a 14th century English recipe collection, includes something nearly identical. Take cheese, cut it in pieces, cast in batter, and fry it. That could sit on a modern appetizer menu without anyone blinking. Of course, not everyone could afford the oil or the cheese. Poorer folks used leftover curds, the soft, squeaky bits that didn't press well into wheels, because they cooked fast and didn't need much heat. These poor man's fritters were the humble cousins of noble delicacies, eaten fresh off the pan with bare hands. And like any good fried snack, they were social. You didn't sit down to eat fried cheese. You ate it standing up, talking, laughing, and licking your fingers clean. It was medieval comfort food, messy, joyful, and unpretentious. So next time you pull a stretchy string of melted cheese from a mozzarella stick, remember that gooey pleasure has roots deep in the past. Long before pubs, long before diners, someone in a smoky medieval kitchen was grinning as the first curds hit the oil, realizing they'd just invented happiness in bite-sized form.
Honey cakes pressed in molds and wrapped in leaves. 1,000 years before anyone talked about packaged snacks, medieval people were already carrying pocket-sized desserts. Honey cakes stamped with patterns, wrapped in leaves, and sweet enough to make a pilgrim smile. Honey was the sugar of the Middle Ages, golden, fragrant, and worth almost as much as gold itself. When people wanted a treat that traveled well, they turned it into little cakes. These honey cakes were the medieval answer to cookies or energy bars. Small, sturdy, and sweet enough to last for days. Street vendors sold them at markets and fairs. Monasteries baked them for travelers, and mothers slipped them into satchels before long journeys. The process was simple but beautiful. A baker would mix flour, eggs, butter, if available, and a generous pour of honey. Sometimes spices like cinnamon, clove, or ginger were added for special occasions, imported flavors that signaled celebration. The thick dough was pressed into wooden molds, carved with flowers, animals, or crosses. When the cakes came out of the oven, the designs stayed imprinted, edible art you could hold in your hand. To keep them fresh, the cakes were wrapped in leaves, often fig, vine, or bay leaves. It wasn't just for looks. The leaves sealed in moisture, added aroma, and protected the cake from dust on long journeys. A traveler could unwrap one days later and still taste the sweetness of home. Some bakers even dipped the cakes in extra honey for shine and preservation. It was sticky, yes, but also self-sealing, nature's glaze. In a world where sugar was rare and expensive, honey made every bite feel luxurious. Festivals and feast days overflowed with it. Children carried warm honey cakes after Mass. Monks gave them to guests as gifts. And during harvest season, towns celebrated by baking them in bulk. The smell of baking honey and spice drifting through narrow streets was the medieval version of a bakery window display, a scent that made people stop and spend. Honey cakes also had spiritual meaning. Honey symbolized purity and divine reward, the land flowing with milk and honey. Monasteries used it to sweeten fasting bread, and pilgrims carried the cakes as food for both body and faith. Recipes survived in medieval manuscripts from Germany, France, and England, all slightly different but built on the same foundation: sweetness, warmth, and care. For peasants, the recipe was simpler: flour, water, and a drizzle of honey brushed on top before baking on a griddle stone. For nobles, it became elaborate, with ground almonds and saffron for color. But the heart of it never changed. Every bite was comfort, energy, and luxury combined. Imagine walking through a crowded market, coins jingling, and catching the scent of warm honey. A vendor hands you a small cake wrapped in a green leaf, soft, fragrant, glowing in the afternoon sun. You bite into it, and for a moment the noise fades. Its simple sweetness, perfectly portable, a millennium-old proof that dessert has always been humanity's favorite invention.
Salt cod sandwiches with mustard, a common sailor's meal. It doesn't sound glamorous, but to a sailor in the 1400s, few things tasted better than 2 slabs of bread hugging a chunk of salty fish and a smear of mustard. That was lunch, dinner, and sometimes survival itself. In the age of wooden ships and endless horizons, salt cod was king. Before refrigeration, it was the one food that could cross oceans without rotting. Sailors depended on it so completely that historians often call it the engine of exploration. You salted enough fish, and suddenly a voyage to the other side of the world became possible. But on deck, all that practicality boiled down to something humble and human: the salt cod sandwich. Here's how it worked. Cod, caught in the cold waters of the North Atlantic, was split, cleaned, and packed in layers of coarse salt until it turned stiff as driftwood. When it was time to eat, sailors soaked the slabs in seawater or fresh water for hours to soften them, then boiled or grilled the fish until it flaked apart. The flavor was intense, oceanic, briny, almost metallic, so they dulled the edge with a smear of mustard, one of the few condiments that traveled well. Press it between hard bread or ship's biscuit, and you had a meal that could survive both the sea and the stomach. On long voyages, food monotony was brutal. Weeks of salted meat, dried peas, and ship's biscuits that could break a tooth made a salty fish sandwich feel like a feast. The mustard added more than flavor. Its vinegar helped preserve the fish, and its burn cleared the nose after days of stale lay below deck. Some sailors mixed it with ale or wine to make a dipping sauce. Others just bit the sandwich straight and washing it down with small beer or watered wine. Salt cod was cheap, durable, and traded by the ton. It fit sailors, soldiers, and cities. When Catholic Europe declared meat off limits on fast days, cod stepped in to save the menu. The fishing grounds of Newfoundland and Scandinavia became lifelines for half the continent. Even inland towns smelled faintly of it on Fridays when markets filled with baskets of dried fish waiting to be revived for supper. And on the docks, just before a ship sailed, vendors sold ready-made cod sandwiches to crews. 2 slices of coarse rye bread, a hunk of resalted fish, and a spoon of mustard, handed over for a coin or two. It was the medieval take on a packed lunch, equal parts protein and practicality. Of course, sailors joked that after months at sea, their taste buds died anyway. Still, that sandwich represented comfort, something solid in a world that rocked underfoot. It was a taste of land, of habit, of home. So next time you grab a tuna melt or a fish sandwich, think of the men who crossed oceans with the same idea. Salt, bread, and a bit of bite to break the monotony. For them, that humble cod and mustard combo wasn't a snack. It was hope you could hold in your hands.
Roast goose legs on market days. The smell hit you before the sound of the market. Smoke, sizzling fat, and the crackle of roasting goose skin. Follow your nose, and you'd find one of the Middle Ages' most mouth-watering sights. Goose legs turning over open fires on market day. Market day was more than shopping. It was a festival for the senses. Farmers brought produce, butchers hung cuts of meat, and bakers filled the air with the scent of yeast and smoke. In the middle of it all stood the roast meat vendors, the stars of the show. Among their best sellers, goose legs, browned to perfection and dripping fat into the coals below. It was the medieval version of fried chicken, greasy, glorious, and completely irresistible. Geese were a staple in medieval Europe, especially in autumn when they were plump and ready for slaughter. They were easier to raise than cattle, and their fat was pure gold, used for cooking, preserving, and even making candles. Nothing went to waste. Feathers became quills, down filled blankets, and meat became both feast and street food. On market days, cooks brought geese already half-roasted from their home hearths, finishing them off on portable spits set over glowing embers in the marketplace. Customers would crowd around, coins ready. The vendors sliced off legs and wings, wrapping them in scraps of parchment or leaves for easy handling. The skin blistered and crisped, the meat rich and smoky. Goose fat spilled onto bread sold nearby, turning even a crusty heel into a luxury. For a few coins, a worker could afford a leg, hot, greasy, and big enough to share. For the hungry poor, the bones left behind were treasures for soup stock. Roast goose wasn't just food. It was spectacle. The vendors performed, spinning the spit, basting with ladles, and calling out with rhyme and wit, hot goose, grease for your beard and meat for your belly." Children pressed forward to watch, mesmerized by the firelight dancing on the skin.
Travelers bought legs to eat on the road, their hands shiny with grease as they walked away chewing. In bigger cities, the goose trade was serious business. Guilds set prices and inspected meat for quality. Goose roasters competed fiercely for the best spots near churches or gates where foot traffic was heavy. On festival days, the smell filled entire neighborhoods. Even the wealthy came down from their carriages to buy a piece fresh off the fire. Because, rich or poor, nobody could resist it. And it wasn't just about flavor. Roast goose was tied to celebration. In many regions, Michaelmas, a harvest festival, was marked by eating goose. The bird symbolized plenty, luck, and hard work rewarded. On those days, the market stalls turned into miniature banquets, each fire a beacon of warmth in the autumn chill. So, imagine standing there, coins in hand, the air thick with smoke and laughter. You bite into a roasted goose leg, juicy, crackling, primal, and for a moment you forget the mud underfoot and the cold wind overhead. That's the magic of medieval street food. Messy, noisy, and utterly human.
Dried figs and almonds as energy snacks. Long before protein bars and trail mix, medieval travelers had their own version of a quick pick-me-up. A handful of dried figs and almonds, nature's original energy snack. If you were hitting the road in the Middle Ages, whether as a pilgrim, a merchant, or a soldier, you didn't pack sandwiches. You packed dried fruit and nuts. They were light, portable, and packed with fuel. Exactly what you needed to walk for miles or trade all day. Among the favorites were figs and almonds, sweet, oily, and in a world without sugar or caffeine, the perfect way to keep your body moving and your spirits high. Figs were a gift from the Mediterranean, soft, chewy, and honey-sweet when dried. Traders from Italy, Spain, and the Levant shipped them by the sackful across Europe. For northerners who rarely saw fresh fruit in winter, dried figs were like candy from another world. Each bite was a little burst of natural sugar, wrapped in seeds that crunched softly between your teeth. Almonds, on the other hand, came mostly from warmer regions too. Spain, southern France, even North Africa, and they were treasured for their long shelf life and versatility. You could eat them plain, toast them over a fire, or crush them into almond milk for fasting days when meat and dairy were banned. Together they were a perfect pair, sweet and savory, soft and crisp. Markets sold them in small paper packets, wrapped in cloth, or measured by the handful from wooden barrels. Pilgrims tucked them into pouches. Soldiers kept them in leather bags by their belts. Monks even carried them on long journeys between abbeys, munching quietly between prayers. In a way, dried figs and almonds were the universal travel ration, clean, easy, and dependable. But they weren't just for survival. They were a luxury too. In noble households, figs and almonds were served at the end of feasts, sometimes drizzled with honey or sprinkled with cinnamon. Cooks shaped them into tiny towers or pressed them into clusters bound with syrup, what we'd now call confections. Almonds in particular were status symbols. They were so expensive in Northern Europe that owning a jar meant you had money to spare. Medieval cooks even called almond milk the milk of kings. Beyond taste, these snacks had meaning. Medieval medicine valued balance in food. Hot, cold, dry, moist. And almonds were considered temperate, the perfect food for harmony. Figs were said to strengthen the heart and purge melancholy. Maybe those old doctors were onto something, because anyone walking all day with an empty stomach probably did feel happier after a handful of them. So imagine a weary traveler resting by a dusty road, pulling a little pouch from his belt. Inside are dried figs, sticky from the heat, and a few almonds shining with oil. He eats slowly, feeling the sugar hit and the fatigue fade. Simple, natural, and utterly timeless. The medieval power snack that needed no label, no wrapper, and no marketing. Just fruit, nuts, and the quiet satisfaction of being ready for the road ahead.
Hard biscuits, ship's bread for travelers on the road. Crack one in half and you'd swear it was a rock. But to a medieval traveler, that rock-hard biscuit, known as ship's bread, was life itself. Before modern snacks, before bakeries and road stops, the one thing you could always count on to survive the journey was hard bread. It went by many names: ship's bread, hardtack, traveler's biscuit, but the idea was the same everywhere. Take simple dough, bake it until every bit of moisture is gone, and you've created something nearly immortal. It could last for years, outlast its maker, and break a few teeth along the way. In a world without preservatives or refrigeration, durability was more valuable than flavor. Ordinary bread went stale within days, but if you baked it twice, slowly, until it was dry as stone, it became almost indestructible. These biscuits were made of just flour, water, and salt. No yeast, no oil. Each one was about the size of your hand and thick enough to survive a fall from a horse. Soldiers, sailors, and pilgrims carried them everywhere. They weren't meant to be enjoyed, they were meant to endure. The name ship's bread came from life at sea, where fresh food was scarce. On ships crossing the Atlantic or navigating the Mediterranean, barrels of hard biscuits were stored below deck. Rats loved them. Sailors did too, reluctantly. You couldn't bite into one without soaking it first. Most dunked their biscuits in ale, broth, or water until soft enough to chew. Some smashed them with a hammer handle before eating. Others crumbled them into stews to thicken the broth. Whatever it took to make it edible, because without it, you'd starve. Land travelers used them too. Pilgrims walking hundreds of miles carried a few biscuits tied in cloth, dry, heavy, but unspoiled. Inns often sold bundles of them near city gates. You could buy a week's worth for a handful of coins and trust it wouldn't mold. A clever invention, really. Part food, part building material. In some diaries, soldiers joked that their biscuits could stop an arrow. The downside, they tasted like nothing. No sweetness, no softness, just crunch and salt. But for a medieval people, that blandness meant survival. Ship's bread kept armies marching, fed explorers crossing oceans, and gave peasants a last resort when winter stores ran low. It was fuel for the body and endurance for the spirit. Even kings ate it when they had to. During long hunts or military campaigns, royal entourages packed barrels of hard biscuits right alongside barrels of wine. The difference was only in presentation. The king's might be wrapped in linen, but it was just as dry. So next time you bite into a cracker or an energy bar on the road, think of the people who did the same 800 years ago.
Only theirs could break a molar. Ship's bread wasn't a treat. It was trust. It didn't have to taste good. It just had to last.
Tiny meat turnovers served at taverns. Walk into a medieval tavern and forget the tankards for a moment. The real treasure wasn't in a mug, but in your hand. A hot, flaky meat turnover, the bite-sized ancestor of today's sliders. When you picture a medieval tavern, you probably think of roaring fires, sloshing ale, and songs about dragons. But if you sat down at one of those smoky wooden tables, you'd also find a tray of small golden pastries filled with steaming meat and herbs. These tiny turnovers were the Middle Ages' answer to bar food, portable, shareable, and perfectly built for greasy fingers and loud company. They went by many names: pastel, rissoles, patties, or simply little pies. The idea was simple. Take bits of leftover meat, chop them finely, season them with onion, garlic, or whatever herbs were on hand, wrap it in dough, and bake or fry until crisp. They were small enough to hold with one hand while the other gripped a mug of ale, an important design feature for the tipsy diner. For tavern owners, these mini pies were genius. They were cheap to make, easy to reheat, and smelled incredible. The scent of sizzling pastry wafting through a tavern door was advertising all by itself. Travelers walking past might stop for just one and end up staying for an hour and a few pints. In a way, the medieval tavern keeper had already discovered the power of bar snacks centuries before anyone coined the term pub grub. The fillings varied wildly depending on the region and the cook's creativity. Some had minced pork or beef with pepper and leeks. Others used pigeon, rabbit, or even eel, whatever scraps were left from the main roast. For the poor, a turnover might contain only vegetables and a trace of fat or gravy for flavor. For the rich, it might include saffron or raisins for a sweet and savory twist. Every bite was a gamble. Would it be spicy, sweet, questionably fresh? You wouldn't know until you tried. Cooks also experimented with size. Big pies were for sharing, but small ones made perfect street food. In cities like London or Bruges, pie sellers carried trays of these little turnovers through the streets, calling out, hot pies, small and fair." They were cheap enough for a worker's lunch, rich enough to feel indulgent, and small enough to sneak into your bag. In taverns, they became a social ritual. Patrons would order a few to share while gambling or storytelling, passing them around as conversation fuel. Some even dipped them in mustard or spiced wine, a medieval version of sauce pairings. Sure, the hygiene standards were questionable, and reheating yesterday's leftovers wasn't exactly safe. But when you bit through that crisp crust and hit a pocket of hot meat and gravy, none of that mattered. It was warm, satisfying, and quick. Everything a traveler or worker needed. So next time you grab a slider or mini pastry at a bar, remember that people were doing the same thing 700 years ago, laughing, drinking, and burning their tongues on the medieval world's most perfect little snack.
Taverns with pre-cooked food displayed on platters for quick order. Think fast food started with drive-thrus? Not even close. Medieval taverns were already doing it. Meals pre-cooked, laid out on platters, and ready to grab before you even sat down. In a time before menus, medieval taverns ran on sight, smell, and impulse. You didn't order from a list, you pointed at what looked good. Behind a counter or along a long wooden table, tavern keepers laid out trays of roasted meats, boiled eggs, thick stews, pies, and bread loaves. Travelers and workers came in from the cold, saw what was steaming or glistening under candlelight, and bought it right then and there. It was food service at its most primal. See it, smell it, eat it. The setup was simple, but brilliant. Medieval taverns catered to a fast-moving crowd, merchants on the road, laborers needing lunch, and pilgrims stopping for shelter. There wasn't time for long waits or complicated orders. The host, or tapster, prepared large batches of food in the morning, meats roasted on spits, soups bubbling in cauldrons, bread sliced thick, and laid them out for display. Prices were often based on size or weight, so customers could pay a few coins for a slice of pie or bowl of stew without breaking their travel budget. The food itself varied wildly depending on the region and wealth of the clientele. In a busy city tavern, you might find roast goose, salted beef, eel pies, and sausages hanging behind the counter. In smaller village inns, it might just be pottage, cheese, and ale. Either way, you could walk in, scan the options, and eat within minutes. For travelers who had spent days on the road with nothing but hard bread, it felt like luxury. This display style also solved a problem: trust. In an age when food safety was more rumor than science, seeing the food before you bought it was a comfort. If the roast looked fresh and the stew smelled good, you were probably safe. The tavern keeper's reputation depended on it. One bad meal and word would spread faster than the plague. Many inns even kept a fire going near the front so customers could watch meat turning on the spit, proof that it was cooked, hot, and honest. And just like modern fast food joints, taverns relied on turnover, not of pies, but of people. The faster a customer ate and left, the more profit for the day. Travelers grabbed their meals to go, workers ate standing up, and locals came for a quick drink before heading back to the fields. The whole operation was built for speed, efficiency, and appetite. Of course, some guests lingered. A good tavern was also the neighborhood's news hub, gambling den, and rumor mill. But the food display remained the centerpiece. It was medieval marketing at its best. No words, no menu boards, just a glowing spread of comfort in a hungry world. So next time you step into a cafe and glance at pastries behind glass or pre-cooked meals on display, remember, you're seeing an old idea reborn. 700 years ago, a hungry traveler pushed open a tavern door, breathed in the smell of roast meat, and said the same thing you probably said 100 times. I'll take that one.
Inns offering set meals instead of menus. Walk into a medieval inn hungry, and don't expect anyone to hand you a menu. You'd eat whatever the cook made that day. One meal, one choice, take it or leave it. Before the age of a la carte dining and fancy menu boards, medieval inns ran on a much simpler idea: the set meal. Travelers didn't get to choose between options. They paid for food, and whatever came out of the kitchen was what everyone ate. No substitutions, no complaints, no "can I get that without onions?" Just a big communal meal, the same for nobles, merchants, and peasants alike. For the innkeeper, it was efficient. Inns along busy roads fed dozens of travelers each day. Pilgrims, soldiers, wagon drivers, and merchants, all arriving hungry and exhausted. There wasn't time to take individual orders or cook custom dishes. The kitchen made one large pot of stew, one roast, one loaf batch, and that was the day's offering. Meals were served at fixed times, often announced by a bell or the innkeeper's shout. Miss the meal, and you'd wait until the next one or go hungry. The set menu usually consisted of what was fresh, available, or left over. A typical inn supper might include pottage, a thick stew of grains and vegetables, some salted meat, coarse bread, and a mug of ale or small beer. On lucky days, there might be roasted fowl or fish. For dessert, if the innkeeper was generous, you might get a baked apple or a bit of cheese. But it was never fancy. The goal was to fill bellies, not impress palates. Meals were served communal style, often at long wooden tables where strangers sat elbow to elbow. A single dish might be shared among several diners, everyone scooping from the same platter. Conversation was inevitable. Travelers traded stories, gossip, and news from the road. Inns weren't just rest stops, they were information hubs. The person sitting next to you might be a pilgrim heading to Canterbury, a merchant from Flanders, or a soldier returning from France. Prices were usually set too. You paid one rate for board and bed, food, drink, and a place to sleep, though the quality of that food depended heavily on the inn's reputation. The best inns prided themselves on hearty portions and honest ingredients. The worst stretched their stews with water and stale bread. There are records of travelers complaining about thin broth and fat bills as early as the 13th century. Proof that bad hospitality has always been a universal complaint. Still, the set meal system had its charm. It made eating simple. You didn't have to decide. Just show up, pay, and eat what the house provided. It created a sense of unity, too. Everyone at the table sharing the same food, the same experience, and, by the end, the same greasy fingers. So the next time you order a chef's special, know that you're continuing an old tradition. Medieval inns were the original all-inclusive restaurants. No menus, no choices, and no arguments. Just food, fellowship, and the quiet satisfaction of a full belly after a long road. Alehouses, brewing on site and serving bread with beer. Forget coffee shops. In the Middle Ages, alehouses were the true neighborhood hangouts. The air smelled of malt and wood smoke, bread was fresh, and the beer was brewed just steps from where you drank it. In medieval towns and villages, you didn't have to go far for a drink. Chances are someone on your street was brewed it. Alehouses weren't big commercial pubs with signs or menus. They were often just private homes where someone, usually a woman known as an alewife, brewed beer in the back room and sold it by the jug. And if you were lucky, she'd serve it with a hunk of fresh bread, still warm from the same fire that heated the brewing pot. Ale was everywhere, not just for celebration, but for survival. Water wasn't always safe to drink, but brewing killed the bacteria, making ale a daily staple for everyone from children to monks. It wasn't strong like modern beer, more like a liquid loaf of bread, cloudy, slightly sweet, and full of calories. A laborer could live on it, especially when paired with bread or cheese. So the local alehouse wasn't just a social hub, it was essential infrastructure. Inside, things were simple. Wooden benches, a long table, and a few jugs or mugs made of wood, horn, or clay. No fancy decor, just laughter, smoke, and the smell of yeast. The alewife would ladle out fresh brewed ale straight from a barrel, often still warm from fermentation. For a few coins more, she'd offer a chunk of bread, thick, coarse, and perfect for soaking up the drink. In many ways, it was a meal disguised as a beverage. Every alehouse had its own recipe. Some used barley, others oats or wheat, depending on local harvests. Herbs called groot, a mix of bog myrtle, yarrow, and rosemary, flavored the ale before hops became common. That meant every house had its own taste, its own smell, its own reputation. Word spread quickly about who brewed the best and who watered theirs down. Local authorities even appointed ale tasters, official testers who went door to door to make sure no one was cheating their customers or poisoning the town. The bread and beer combo was no accident. Brewing and baking were practically siblings. Both used grain, yeast, and heat. Many alewives often baked with the same malted flour used for brewing, giving the bread a sweet, earthly flavor. When served together, the two foods completed each other, one to fill the stomach, the other to wash it down. But alehouses weren't just about sustenance. They were the medieval version of the cafe, the gossip corner, and the town hall rolled into one. People came to relax, trade news, argue, flirt, and sometimes fight. Songs were sung, deals were made, and on lucky nights, the alewife might even host a small feast. So picture it. You step into a smoky room, a wooden mug in hand, and bite into bread baked from the same grain you're drinking. That's not just a meal, it's history in liquid form. Medieval alehouses where communities were built, one mug and one loaf at a time.
Common drinking cups shared between strangers. Thirsty? In a medieval tavern, you didn't get your own glass. You just grabbed whatever cup was nearest. Drinking with strangers wasn't just normal, it was expected. In the crowded glow of a medieval alehouse, cups were communal and trust was negotiable. You didn't walk in and get your own mug. That was far too luxurious. Instead, a handful of shared drinking cups sat on the table or hung from nails on the wall, waiting for the next round of hands and mouths. Whether you were a farmer, a merchant, or a weary pilgrim, everyone drank from the same vessels. It was part of the unspoken code of medieval hospitality. Drink, don't dawdle, and pass it on. Glassware was expensive. Most ordinary people never owned a cup of their own, and taverns couldn't afford dozens of individual mugs. So they made do with what they had: wooden tankards, pewter goblets, or leather mugs called blackjacks. When one person finished drinking, they'd wipe the rim with their sleeve, if they were polite, and slide it to the next person. At long tavern tables, cups were in constant circulation, sloshing, clinking, and splashing as laughter rose over the firelight. Inns sometimes provided one communal jug or pitcher for each table. Guests would pour ale into the shared cup, take a gulp, and refill it for the next in line. This ritual, a mixture of thrift and trust, created instant camaraderie.
Strangers became companions after just a few shared sips. And when the jug was empty, the loudest drinker would yell for the alewife to fill it again. It wasn't all reckless. Medieval people actually saw sharing cups as a gesture of friendship or peace. To drink from the same vessel was to prove you meant no harm, that your drink wasn't poisoned and your intentions were good. Lords sealed alliances this way. Peasants sealed friendships. The phrase to drink together meant far more than it does today. It was a social bond in liquid form. Of course, hygiene wasn't great. Diseases passed easily, and the idea of germs wouldn't exist for centuries. But water was often unsafe, and ale, boiled and fermented, was considered far cleaner. So people shared without hesitation, trusting the gods and the alcohol to kill whatever might be lurking on the rim. In wealthier taverns, cups might be rinsed in communal basins between rounds, which helped, at least symbolically. But more often, the cleaning method was a quick dip in ale, a wipe with a rag, and back into circulation. Still, nobody minded. The ale was flowing, the fire was warm, and for a few coins you were part of something bigger than yourself, a noisy, joyful fellowship of drinkers. So picture it, a dim room, candlelight flickering, a jug making its way around the table, laughter spilling out into the night. Someone hands you a wooden cup, half full and dripping foam, and you drink. You don't ask whose it was. You just raise it, smile, and pass it on, just like they did hundreds of years ago. Roasted meat carved from a communal spit. No plates, no personal portions, just one massive spit turning over the fire, and everyone with a knife waiting their turn to carve off a slice of sizzling meat. If you ever walked into a medieval tavern or market and saw a crowd huddled around a fire, you were witnessing one of the oldest and most universal scenes in human history: communal roasting. A whole animal, pig, goose, lamb, or sometimes even an ox, turning slowly over glowing coals, fat dripping into the flames, filling the air with that primal, mouth-watering scent of meat and smoke. It wasn't just cooking, it was theater, and the main act was the moment someone shouted, "It's done!" The spit was the centerpiece of medieval feasting. In inns, markets, and even at village gatherings, it wasn't unusual for everyone to eat from the same roast. There were no individual steaks or cuts to order, just one giant meal shared by all. Once the meat was ready, the cook or innkeeper carved off thick slices for paying guests, but it wasn't a private experience. Strangers stood shoulder to shoulder, knives in hand, waiting for their piece. Some inns even let travelers carve their own share, slicing from the roast while it still hissed and smoked. It was as much social ritual as sustenance. People joked, gossiped, and traded news while the meat turned. Travelers told stories from the road. Locals debated politics between bites. The communal spit made strangers into companions. You could learn a person's temperament by how they carved, careful and measured, or greedy and quick. The meat itself depended on the crowd and the season. At inns, smaller animals like chickens, ducks, or rabbits were common. On feast days or market fairs, entire pigs or sheep roasted on long iron spits, sometimes powered by turnspit dogs, small canines trained to run inside wheel cages to rotate the spit. Wealthy feasts might boast multi-tiered spits stacked with layers of meat and birds dripping onto each other for maximum flavor. But even the simplest setup, a single bird on a stick over a shared flame, was enough to draw a hungry crowd. There was something beautifully practical about it. One fire meant one cook, one cleanup, and endless portions. It kept food hot for hours and smelled irresistible from half a street away. Vendors didn't need fancy kitchens or equipment, just a fire pit, a spit, and the patience to keep it turning. The sight of glistening roast meat was advertisement enough. Of course, the experience wasn't always elegant. The same knife that carved the roast often doubled as your eating utensil, and table manners were more suggestion than rule. Grease ran down chins, bread caught the drippings, and laughter drowned out any sense of decorum. But that was the point. It was food as community, as spectacle, as celebration of simple pleasure. So imagine standing near that crackling fire, your face warm, your stomach growling, the smell of roast meat thick in the air. You grip your knife, wait your turn, and finally slice off your share, still steaming, still sizzling. One bite, and you realize why nobody needed menus. The spit was democracy at its finest. One fire, one feast, and enough flavor for everyone.
Candlelight dining with communal trenchers. Dinner by candlelight sounds romantic until you realize you're sharing one plate of bread with 3 strangers and the candles are dripping wax into your soup. Forget polished tables and silverware. A medieval dinner was equal parts chaos and charm. Picture a long wooden table lit by flickering candles, shadows dancing across faces, and everyone eating from the same trencher, a thick slab of stale bread that served as both plate and napkin. It was warm, crowded, loud, and somehow still felt like home. Trenchers were the medieval solution to dishwashing. Instead of plates, hosts used yesterday's bread, dense, hard loaves cut into flat rounds. You'd heap your stew, meat, or gravy on top, eat what you could, and let the bread soak up the rest. When you finished, you could either eat your plate or toss it to the poor waiting outside. Nothing wasted, no cleanup needed, an eco-friendly system 1,000 years ahead of its time. Dining by candlelight wasn't a luxury, it was necessity. Most halls and taverns had no windows or only tiny slits for light. When the sun went down, candles and torches were the only way to see your food. Barely. The flickering light made everything shimmer. Grease on roasted meat, steam from hot pottage, the occasional fly circling above. Shadows turned even ordinary meals into theater. And yet that dim light gave everything a kind of rough beauty. The glow softened the grime, hid the cracks, and made the simplest dinner feel like a ritual. Meals were communal, not individual. Families, travelers, and strangers all sat together, elbows touching, sharing trenchers between 2 or 3 people. A cup of ale might be passed down the line, and knives were shared too. Forks were a novelty, mostly reserved for the elite. You'd cut a slice of meat, mop up gravy with the bread, and talk, argue, or laugh with whoever fate sat beside you. Eating was a social act, not a quiet one. For the poor, the bread trencher might be the only edible part of the meal.
It soaked up fat, salt, and flavor, transforming plain bread into something rich and filling. For the wealthy, trenchers became more symbolic. Servants replaced them mid-meal, and leftovers were donated to beggars as an act of piety. But no matter the class, the ritual stayed the same: food, bread, light, and company. Candlelight brought its own hazards, though. Flames dripped wax on tables and into dishes. Smoke stung eyes. The smell of tallow candles, made from animal fat, mixed with meat and ale in a heady, greasy perfume that clung to clothes. But to medieval diners, that was the scent of evening itself, the smell of warmth, fullness, and survival. So picture it, the room buzzing with talk, dogs prowling under tables, the glow of candles turning the air golden. Someone laughs, someone prays, someone tears a hunk of bread from your shared trencher. You eat, drink, and wipe your hands on the same loaf. It's messy, smoky, and alive. A communal feast in the truest sense, where light, hunger, and humanity met at one flickering table.
Patrons seated by social class. In a medieval inn, where you sat said everything. The closer you were to the fire, the higher your status. And if you were noble, your meal didn't just come faster, it came first. Walk into a medieval tavern or roadside inn, and you'd notice something immediately. Not all customers were treated equally. There were no reservations or VIP lounges, but there was a clear hierarchy, one written in seating arrangements, manners, and even the order of service. The world outside was divided by class, and so was the dining table. At the top of the room, near the hearth or central fire, sat the best seats, warm, well lit, and closest to the fresh food coming from the kitchen. These were reserved for nobles, knights, wealthy merchants, or high-ranking travelers. The further you sat from the fire, the lower your social rank. Commoners, laborers, and servants often ended up near the door, shivering every time it opened, waiting for scraps or cold portions of stew long after the privileged few had eaten. The rules were rarely written, but everyone knew them. A noble guest could walk in and expect immediate service. A fresh cup of ale, the best slice of roast, and a seat far from the smoke. The innkeeper would bow, make small talk, and ensure the noble's food was served before anyone else's. A peasant or traveler, meanwhile, might wait an hour for the same dish, reheated, half-portioned, or pulled from the dregs of the pot. It wasn't just about respect, it was about survival and business. Nobles had influence. A good word from a knight could make an inn famous. A complaint could ruin it. So tavern keepers catered to power. Some even kept a separate upper chamber, a small private room upstairs where lords could dine away from the noise and smell of the common room. Down below, travelers jostled for space on benches, eating with their hands, shouting over the din. 2 worlds, 1 roof. The kitchen ran like a hierarchy, too. Dishes for nobles came from the front of the pot, the best cuts, the richest gravy. The poor got what was left. In some places, commoners weren't even allowed to sit inside when high-status guests were present. They had to eat standing near the door or outside. And yet, everyone accepted it. In a society where class was destiny, even dinner followed the rules.
But there were moments of quiet rebellion. Minstrels, soldiers, or bold travelers sometimes earned better seats through charm or coin. A well-told story could win an extra cup of ale. A tip could earn you a place closer to the hearth. And in the warmth of the evening, when the ale started to flow and laughter drowned out titles, the line between noble and peasant sometimes blurred, briefly. Still, as dawn came and the fire cooled, the old order returned. Nobles left full and comfortable. The rest cleaned up and hoped tomorrow's stew wouldn't run out before their turn. In medieval dining, your seat wasn't just a spot at the table. It was a mirror of your place in the world.
Tapster. Women pouring ale for customers. If you walked into a medieval tavern, the person behind the counter wasn't a burly barkeep. It was usually a woman, apron dusted with grain and hands steady on the tap. She was the tapster, and she ruled the alehouse. In the Middle Ages, brewing wasn't a man's business. It was a woman's craft. Across towns and villages, tapster women ran alehouses from their own kitchens, serving homemade beer to travelers, workers, and neighbors. Before big breweries, before commercial pubs, these women were the beating heart of local drinking culture. Entrepreneurs, hostesses, and sometimes the only reason a village stayed cheerful through winter. The word tapster came from the simple act of tapping the ale barrel, driving wooden spigot into the cask and pouring with practiced precision. But it carried weight. A skilled tapster knew how to pour without wasting a drop, how to spot when ale had gone sour, and, maybe most importantly, how to keep rowdy customers in line. Many worked alone or with daughters and sisters, tending fires, cleaning mugs, and managing crowds of thirsty men who'd just finished a long day in the fields. Alehouses were usually part of the tapster's home. The front room became the bar. The back room stored the barrels, and the kitchen doubled as the brewery. The smell of malt and yeast mixed with wood smoke, and the sound of laughter filled the air. Customers came not just for the drink, but for the company. The tapster's personality mattered as much as her ale. Too strict, and patrons left. Too lenient, and the place turned into a brawl. And yes, tapsters could make good money, sometimes more than their husbands. Women controlled the brewing, the sales, and the profit. In many records, brewster, female brewer, and tapster appear together, because the same woman often made and sold her own ale. But with success came suspicion. Moralists accused alewives of watering down drinks, cheating customers, or encouraging sin and gossip. Church preachers even warned that alehouses were gateways to hell, filled with temptation and loose talk. Still, the ale kept flowing, and the tapsters kept pouring. These women were also vital to travelers. On long roads, where inns were rare or expensive, a tapster's house was a haven. A tired pilgrim could knock, pay a few coins, and find warmth, drink, and sometimes a bed of straw by the hearth stove. Many towns relied on them for steady income and for the news that always followed the ale. Gossip traveled faster than carts, carried from tapster to tapster along the trade routes. Their tools were simple: a few casks, a sturdy bench.
mugs of wood or horn, and that crucial tap hammer for sealing barrels. But their skill ran deep, knowing when to brew, how to balance sweetness and bitterness, and how to keep peace when the ale turned strong and tempers flared. So, next time you picture medieval taverns, forget the mustached innkeeper. Picture her instead. Sleeves rolled up, tapping a fresh cask with one hand, steadying a foam-topped mug with the other. She was part brewer, part hostess, part peacekeeper. In a world run by men, the tapster ran the bar, and everyone respected the hand that poured the ale.
Tavern signs with pictorial logos. Before neon signs and catchy brand names, tavern signs had their own marketing genius: pictures. A painted boar or golden cup or hanging boot told you everything you needed to know, even if you couldn't read a single word. In a world where most people couldn't read their own name, words were useless as advertising. So taverns, alehouses, and inns relied on something far more effective: symbols. If you walked through a medieval town, you'd see carved wooden signs swaying over doors, painted with animals, tools, or even puns. A red lion meant strong ale. A swan promised clean lodgings. A painted barrel meant beer on tap. You didn't need to ask where to eat or drink. The pictures shouted it from across the street. These signs weren't decoration. They were lifelines for business. Travelers looked for familiar images as they passed through strange towns. A merchant might always stop at the Boar's Head. A pilgrim might trust the Crossed Keys. Each sign became a brand before branding existed, a mark of reputation known along trade routes and among regulars. If a sign was beautifully painted or cleverly carved, it stood out in a sea of gray stone and mud. Some even glowed at night. Tavern keepers hung lanterns behind the signs, creating the medieval equivalent of illuminated advertising. Because so few people could read, tavern names were often chosen for how they looked or sounded, not what they said. A tavern keeper with a good sense of humor might pick a visual pun, a picture of a boot and a crown for the king's boot, or a bear holding a staff for the bear and staff. Others went for saints or biblical symbols to sound respectable, like the angel or the lamb. The most popular signs across Europe were the star, the swan, and the red lion, all easy to paint and easy to remember. And while noble estates and guild halls used family crests, tavern signs belonged to the people. They were the language of the streets, open to anyone with a brush and a bit of imagination. Many were hand-carved by local artisans or even the tavern keeper themselves. Over time, those signs aged, faded, or burned in fires, but the traditions never died. Even centuries later, English pubs and European inns still carry those same names, echoes of a world that is read in pictures. The signs were also social markers. The type of image hinted at what kind of crowd you'd find inside. A sign with religious imagery might suggest a quiet end for travelers. A roaring bear or stag usually meant a louder, rougher drinking crowd. Locals learned to read these clues instinctively long before literacy became common. So imagine walking through a smoky medieval street at dusk. You can't read the shop names, but you don't need to. A creaking wooden board swings overhead, painted with a golden cup and a loaf of bread. You smile,
That's your spot. Inside, the tapster's waiting, the ale is flowing, and the sign outside keeps swinging in the wind, a wordless invitation written in paint and memory.
Soup or pottage constantly simmering. Walk into a medieval kitchen or tavern, and you'd always hear it, the low bubble of a pot that never stopped cooking. Whatever was inside that cauldron, that was the day's meal, yesterday's leftovers, and tomorrow's dinner, all in one. Long before restaurants bragged about their soup of the day, medieval cooks had already perfected the concept, a single pot of pottage that never truly ended. It was part soup, part stew, part time capsule. You didn't start from scratch each morning. You just kept the fire alive, added whatever scraps or vegetables you had, and let the pot simmer forever. Some families joked that their pottage was older than their children, and they weren't entirely wrong. In a world without refrigeration, the steady simmer was the best preservation method around. The heat kept the food safe, and the constant bubbling meant nothing ever spoiled. Each day's ingredients layered on top of the last. Onions and barley one day, cabbage and beans the next, maybe a bone or two if luck allowed. The flavor deepened with every hour, becoming something rich, smoky, and oddly comforting. The taste of survival. Taverns and inns rely on this same method. A large black pot hung over the hearth all day and night, ready to ladle out at a moment's notice. Travelers would walk in, hand over a coin, and get a bowlful of whatever was cooking. The medieval version of ordering the usual. It wasn't fancy, but it was hot, filling, and fast. Even nobles had their own version, more luxurious, made with meat stock and spices, but the same principle, always ready, always simmering. In peasant homes, pottage was the foundation of life. Bread might come and go, meat might be a rare blessing, but there was always a pot. Mothers taught daughters how to tend it, when to stir, when to add water, when to scrape the sides before it burned. Every region had its own twist. English peasants added leeks and oats. French villagers used lentils and herbs. Germans threw in cabbage, beer, or whatever leftovers remained. The smell of pottage filled entire neighborhoods, earthy, savory, and thick with smoke from the fire. It wasn't just food, it was background noise for medieval life. Kids played near it, dogs begged under it, and visitors judged a household's prosperity by what they smelled in the pot. A thin, watery stew meant hard times. A rich, meaty aroma meant good fortune, or at least a successful hunt. And when the pot was finally cleaned, it wasn't scrubbed to a shine. It was seasoned, its walls stained with the ghosts of 100 meals. That flavor stayed, like history written in grease and soot. So imagine it. You walk into a small tavern, the air thick with the scent of onions, herbs, and wood smoke. The cook looks up, wipes her hands, and says, "You'll have the soup, then?" There's no other choice, and you don't need one. The ladle dips, steam rises, and for a few coins You're part of a tradition that never stopped simmering.
Drunken food fights or alehouse brawls over last servings. You think bar fights are a modern problem? Try a medieval alehouse where the spark wasn't spilled beer. It was the last goose leg on the table. Alehouses were where medieval life got loud. They weren't quiet taverns or polite dining halls. They were smoky, crowded, chaotic rooms filled with laughter, arguments, and more ale than sense. And when hunger mixed with alcohol, things got entertaining. The phrase alehouse brawl was so common in court records that it might as well have been a weekly event. Most started small, a spilled drink, an insult, or a piece of food snatched too quickly, but they could end with broken jugs, flying trenchers, and the entire table overturned in glorious, greasy chaos. Picture it. A wooden table crowded with strangers, mugs clinking, candles flickering, and bowls of stew or roast meat shared communally. Everyone's half drunk, loud, and elbowing for a better bite. The food's almost gone, maybe a single sausage or chunk of bread left on the platter. Someone reaches for it. Another hand grabs at the same time. There's a pause, a glare, and then a roar of laughter or a punch in the jaw, depending on how generous the ale has made them. Medieval taverns were equal parts social club and powder keg. Most had no separate tables or private rooms, so peasants, laborers, and travelers all sat shoulder to shoulder. Ale loosened tongues fast, and when supplies ran short, which they often did, tempers flared. The worst fights usually broke out late in the evening, when food was low, mugs were emptying, and the fire was burning down to coals. Some brawls began with playful throwing, a bone here, a crust there, but could end with benches breaking and fists flying. Chroniclers and city officials complained constantly about these scenes. In 14th century London, records show dozens of charges each month for affray in taverns. Inns near docks and markets were notorious, places where sailors, carters, and soldiers gathered to eat, drink, and argue about whose turn it was to pay. In one case from York, a fight started when a man stole from the pot without consent, basically ladling out stew before his turn, and ended with 3 broken teeth and a smashed ale jug. The food fights weren't just about hunger, they were about pride. In a society obsessed with status, even the smallest insult could explode when ale lowered inhibitions. If you felt disrespected over a meal, it wasn't just about losing the last bite. It was about losing face. And in a world where swords and knives were everyday tools, even a drunken quarrel could turn deadly fast. Still, for every brawl there were a dozen nights that ended in laughter, slurred singing, shared scraps, and comradeship born out of bad manners. Ale houses were messy, but they were also equalizing. Rich or poor, saint or sinner, everyone got loud, got hungry, and sometimes got into trouble. So imagine it, the fire crackling, the air thick with smoke and spilled ale, the last morsel of meat gleaming on a wooden plate. You reach for it, and so does someone else. For a split second, it's a standoff. Then laughter, shouting, and a flying trencher. That was medieval nightlife, rowdy, communal, and never, ever dull. Inns advertising clean straw. You've seen hotels brag about 5-star comfort. In the Middle Ages, all they had to promise was clean straw. And believe it or not, that was enough to make travelers cheer. Before roadside motels and all-inclusive hotels, there were inns, the lifeline of every weary medieval traveler. They didn't need to promise luxury, just a roof, a hot meal, and a pile of fresh straw that didn't smell like the last guy. That phrase, clean straw, was the medieval world's version of vacancy. Simple, practical, and maybe a little itchy. Travel in the Middle Ages was exhausting. Roads were rough, journeys long, and daylight short. When darkness fell, finding a safe place to sleep mattered more than comfort. Inns popped up along trade routes, near city gates and beside churches, offering quick food and faster lodging. A traveler might see a hand-painted sign swinging in the wind, good ale, hot stew, clean straw. Those 3 words said it all. Dinner, drink, and a semi-hygienic place to pass out. The straw wasn't metaphorical. Beds as we know them were rare and expensive. Most inns offered large communal sleeping rooms where guests lay side by side on the floor or in shared bunks stuffed with hay. The clean part was mostly wishful thinking. If an innkeeper had recently replaced the straw, it meant fewer fleas and a better night's rest. If not, well, you itched your way through the night. Travelers often carry their own blankets, hoping to add a thin layer between themselves and whatever lived in the straw below. But the combination of food and lodging made these places irresistible. For a few coins, you could fill your stomach and collapse under a roof. No tents, no rain, no fear of wolves. Inns were the medieval version of the service station. Part restaurant, part rest stop, part rumor hub. You might eat your pottage or stew in the common room downstairs, surrounded by strangers trading news, then head up to the loft or barn to sleep. Dogs curled at the foot of beds, boots hung on by the fire, and the whole room breathed together like one giant snoring chorus. Innkeepers knew how to market their comfort. Clean straw sounded like luxury compared to the alternatives, ditches, stables, or open fields. Some inns even advertised fresh straw by scattering it outside the door as a visible sign of cleanliness. Others offered an upgrade, new straw and warm ale, the medieval equivalent of bed and breakfast. It wasn't glamorous, but it worked. Pilgrims, soldiers, and merchants planned their routes by trusted inns, remembering the ones with good ale and fewer fleas. Some innkeepers became local legends, known for their hospitality, their stew, or their miraculous ability to keep straw dry in the rain. So picture it. A weary traveler trudging through the dark, seeing candlelight flicker through a window and a sign swaying in the wind. Clean straw, it says. You push open the door, smell ale and soup, and know you've made it. No 5-star suite, no silk sheets, just warmth, food, and a place to rest your bones. In the Middle Ages, that was all the comfort anyone needed. Monastic guest houses functioning as early rest stops. Long before highway rest stops or budget hotels, travelers found refuge in the quietest places imaginable. Monasteries. No neon signs, no room keys, just monks, prayer bells, and a promise of food, warmth, and rest. In the Middle Ages, travel wasn't just tiring, it was dangerous. Roads were muddy, robbers were common, and daylight never seemed long enough. But scattered across Europe, there were sanctuaries where anyone, Pilgrim, merchant, or wanderer could knock on a wooden door and be welcomed in. These were the monastic guest houses, the world's first chain of free or cheap lodging for weary souls. Every monastery had a guest wing or hospitium, often near the entrance, so visitors wouldn't disturb the monk's cloistered life. The idea came straight from Scripture. Do not forget to show hospitality to strangers. And the monks took it seriously. If you arrived hungry, you were fed. If you arrived sick, they found you a bed. No one was turned away, whether you were a nobleman in silk or a barefoot pilgrim on the road to Canterbury. The guest house wasn't luxurious, but it was orderly and calm, a stark contrast to the noisy taverns and flea-ridden inns of the outside world. Guests slept on straw mattresses, sometimes in shared rooms, sometimes alone if space allowed. Meals were simple but filling. Thick pottage, bread, cheese, and ale or watered wine. Everything followed the rhythm of the monastery. Bells for prayer, silence at night, and a sense of quiet reverence that wrapped around you like a blanket. Travelers often described monasteries as oases on the road. The guest house wasn't just a place to rest, it was a place to breathe. The monks provided food and shelter not for profit, but as an act of charity. In return, guests were expected to behave respectfully. No loud talk, no drunkenness, and definitely no gambling. If you broke the rules, you'd be politely but firmly shown the door. Many monasteries became famous for their hospitality. Along pilgrimage routes, especially to Santiago de Compostela or Rome, they functioned almost like a medieval network of rest stops. Pilgrims could travel from abbey to abbey, knowing that each would offer a warm meal, clean water, and spiritual guidance. The monks even tended to travelers' wounds, acting as impromptu doctors long before hospitals became common. Of course, not all guest houses were equal. Wealthy abbeys offered private rooms and fresh linen for noble visitors. Smaller monasteries could offer only the bare essentials, a bowl of stew, a place by the fire, and perhaps a blessing for the road ahead. But the intent was always the same, to give travelers a safe haven in a perilous world. So imagine it. You have been walking for days through cold rain, your cloak heavy, your boots soaked. You see a flicker of torchlight ahead, stone walls, an arched gate, and the sound of chanting. A monk opens the door, candle in hand, and quietly says, "Come in, traveler. Rest." Inside, it's warm. There's bread on the table, soup on the fire, and silence in the air. No charge, no rush, just peace. The kind you can only find where the world stops to pray.
Taverns in ports serving fried fish. Long before London street vendors wrapped cod and potatoes in newspaper, medieval port taverns were already sizzling, frying fish fresh off the boats and serving it to sailors who couldn't wait for tomorrow's catch. The smell hit you first. Hot oil, sea salt, and something crisp crackling in the pan. Stepped closer to any medieval port from London to Bruges, and you'd find taverns and cookshops doing brisk business with one dish, fried fish, golden and steaming, eaten straight from the pan with a hunk of bread. It wasn't called fish and chips yet. Potatoes wouldn't even arrive in Europe for centuries.
But the idea was already there. Quick, hot, and satisfying food for people on the move. Port taverns were the beating hearts of medieval coastal towns. Ships came and went at all hours, unloading cargo, fish, and sailors hungry enough to eat anything that didn't swim away. The taverns closest to the docks learned fast. Fresh fish sold better fried than stewed. They'd dredge fillets in flour or barley meal, toss them into hot oil or lard, and serve them up with coarse salt, pickled onions, or a wedge of brown bread. The oil sealed in the flavor and kept the fish warm longer, making it the perfect grab-and-go meal for sailors heading back to sea. And it wasn't just luxury. It was practicality. Fried fish was portable, preserved better than boiled, and easy to sell in bulk. Fishermen often sold part of their catch directly to taverns instead of waiting for market day, knowing the fried version could fetch more coins by nightfall. By the time the docks quieted, the taverns glowed with lantern light, fires still roaring, and the sound of sizzling fat echoing through the narrow streets. These seaside cookshops were chaotic, smoky, and alive with noise. You'd hear 10 languages at once: sailors from the Baltic, traders from Genoa, dockhands from Flanders, all crammed together, tearing into fried fish with their hands. Some washed it down with small beer, others with strong wine imported by the barrel. The combination of salt, grease, and alcohol hit like a warm wave after days of cold sea wind. Records from the 13th and 14th centuries mentioned fish fried in oil of olives or lard, sold to travelers and laborers alike. It was fast food before anyone called it that. Affordable, immediate, and utterly addictive. By the late medieval period, these fish taverns were common in every major port, from the Thames to the Mediterranean. Some even served fried eels, sprats, or herring, the cheap staples of working-class diets for centuries to come. For sailors, this was more than a snack. It was comfort. The taste of fried fish meant land, warmth, and a few precious hours away from the rolling sea. It filled stomachs and soothed souls, a small luxury after a hard voyage. So imagine it: lanterns swaying in the sea breeze, the hiss of oil as another batch hits the pan, sailors crowding at the counter with coins in hand. A woman behind the bar drops fillets into the fryer, scoops them out with a wooden ladle, and serves them piping hot. The night smells of salt, smoke, and bread, and for a moment, everyone in the port forgets the ocean waiting just beyond the tavern door.
Alehouses fined for watering down beer. Every age has its food scandals. Today, it's fake meat or mislabeled tuna. In the Middle Ages, it was watered-down ale. And trust me, that was enough to make a whole village riot. In a world where beer was safer than water, the local alehouse was sacred ground. People depended on it, not just for pleasure, but for survival. So when word spread that a tapster had watered down her ale, tempers flared fast. To cheat a customer out of a strong drink was more than bad business. It was almost a sin. And medieval towns took it seriously enough to make it a punishable crime. Alehouses were everywhere, often run out of ordinary homes, their doors marked with a broom, a branch, or a pitcher signifying ale was for sale. Brewing was usually done by women, called alewives,
who made their own batches and sold them straight from the barrel. But ingredients weren't cheap, and competition was fierce. Some alewives, or even full-fledged taverns, found a tempting shortcut. Add extra water to the barrel, stretch the supply, and hope no one noticed. The problem? Everyone noticed. A weak pint was an insult to pride as much as to the palate. Towns appointed officials called ale tasters, yes, that was a real job, whose sole duty was to go from house to house tasting beer and checking its quality. If they found it weak, sour, or suspiciously thin, they could fine the alehouse or have the owner publicly shamed. Sometimes the punishment was as theatrical as the crime. An offending tapster might be forced to carry a bucket of her bad ale through the streets while the crowd jeered, or have her brewing tools destroyed in front of everyone. But even with inspections, the temptation to cheat never disappeared. Medieval records are full of these small fast food scandals. Tavern keepers caught watering ale, bakers fined for short-weight loaves, butchers selling spoiled meat. It was the eternal tug-of-war between greed and survival. Ale was currency, reputation, and lifeblood all at once. If your brew was good, your name spread quickly. If it wasn't, so did your downfall. For the drinkers, it was personal. Ale wasn't just a beverage, it was part of daily life. Workers drank it at dawn, children drank diluted versions at supper, and travelers trusted it more than any stream. A weak ale meant you'd been cheated out of nutrition and warmth, the medieval equivalent of being served cold fries and calling it dinner. And yet, for all the crackdowns, the alehouse never lost its pull. People still crowded into them each night, laughing, singing, and drinking whatever was on tap. It might have been strong, maybe it was weak, but it was communal, alive, and real. The occasional scandal just added to the gossip. So picture it. A smoky alehouse packed shoulder to shoulder, mugs raised high, someone shouting, "This tastes like bathwater." The room erupts in laughter, and the alewife behind the counter glares, praying the ale taster isn't within earshot. The drink might be a little thin tonight, but the story, that one will last all week. Pop-up booths at fairs selling hot pastries and mead. Imagine the smell of cinnamon, honey, and wood smoke drifting through a crowd. Laughter, shouting, and music echoing from every direction. Welcome to the medieval fair, where pop-up food booths were the original food trucks, and business was booming. For a few days each year, the quiet fields outside medieval towns transformed into bustling wonderlands of noise, color, and chaos. These were the great fairs, part marketplace, part carnival, part social event, and they were where the best food in the kingdom came sizzling, bubbling, and steaming to life. Farmers brought their livestock, merchants brought their wares, and clever cooks brought something even better: hot pastries and mead, ready to sell to anyone hungry, happy, or halfway drunk. Permanent restaurants didn't exist, but fair booths filled that gap perfectly. They were built overnight, wooden stalls, tents, or even carts with portable hearths, simple enough to set up fast and tear down after the crowds left. A few planks, a pan, and a fire were all you needed to start selling. And if your food smelled good enough, you'd have a line of peasants, knights, and travelers before sunrise. The menu was simple but irresistible. Hot pastries were a star attraction. Golden little pockets of meat, cheese or spiced fruit, baked on site and eaten with the hands. They were cheap, portable, and messy in the best possible way. Honey-glazed rolls, nut-stuffed tarts, or meat pies wrapped in flaky dough could be sold for a few pennies, and every bite tasted like luxury compared to the porridge and pottage of daily life. And what better to wash it down with than mead, the drink of honey, water, and fermentation? Sweet, smooth, and dangerously strong, it was the medieval fair's version of a festival beer. Vendors sold it warm in clay cups or poured it cold from wooden casks, shouting over the din to lure in passerby. "Hot pies, sweet mead, fresh from the fire!" Their voices rose above the minstrels, jugglers, and animal traders, blending into the wild symphony of the fairground. These fairs weren't just about food. They were where worlds collided. Pilgrims mingled with nobles, monks brushed shoulders with gamblers, and everyone, rich or poor, spent at least a few coins on a treat. Street performers danced near the pastry stands. Pickpockets worked the mead lines, and cooks bragged about whose pie crust stayed crispest longest in the cold. The air was thick with heat, noise, and the clinking of mugs. For many, these food stalls were the highlight of the fair, a rare chance to eat something indulgent and hot. The fair was temporary, fleeting, but unforgettable. When it ended, the booths vanished, leaving only trampled grass, scorch marks from the fires, and the memory of sweet honey and hot pastry in the air. Meat roasted on portable spits for fair crowds. Forget carnival corn dogs. Medieval fairs had something far better. Whole animals turning on spits, fat sizzling, smoke rising, and hungry crowds lined up with knives and coins in hand. When a medieval fair rolled into town, it wasn't just a market, it was a feast. Music, merchants, dancers, gamblers, jugglers, and right at the center of it all, the fire pits. Dozens of them glowing red beneath clouds of savory smoke. This was where the fair truly came alive, where cooks roasted meat over portable spits and turned ordinary hunger into pure spectacle. There was no food more primal, more magnetic than meat roasting in public. Cooks and butchers hauled in everything from chickens and rabbits to pigs and goats, threading them onto iron rods that spun slowly over the flames. The sound was hypnotic, a steady crackle, the occasional hiss of dripping fat hitting coals, and the rhythmic creak of turning handles. Each booth was its own theater, the cook both chef and showman. The setup was simple but brilliant. Portable spits were designed for travel, metal rods balanced on collapsible wooden frames, easy to set up anywhere there was room for a fire. Vendors arrived early, started the fires, and by mid-morning the smell alone had drawn half the fair to their corner. They didn't need signs or slogans. The aroma of sizzling meat was its own advertisement. Customers paid by the portion, the skewer, or even by the slice. The cook would carve directly from the roast, handing over hot, dripping chunks of pork, goose, or lamb on bread or leaves to catch the grease. Wealthier fairgoers might buy an entire joint for their group. Poorer ones settled for a few scraps and a mouthful of gravy-soaked bread. But everyone, no matter how poor, got a taste of the festival's fire. And this wasn't quiet dining. The roasting pits were surrounded by laughter, shouting, and the sound of mugs clinking. Performers often set up nearby. Jugglers, musicians, and ballad singers knew the best crowds gathered where the food was. Children darted between booths, dogs lurked under tables waiting for bones, and the whole air smelled of meat, ale, and excitement. These fire-roasted feasts also served a deeper purpose. For most medieval people, meat was a rare luxury, something eaten only a few times a year. Fairs changed that. For a day or two, even a peasant could afford a bite of roast meat, cooked fresh and eaten in the open air. It turned hunger into celebration, transforming a basic need into a community ritual. By sunset, the fairground looked like a battlefield of feasting. Bones scattered, fires dying down, and smoke drifting through the twilight. The cooks wiped their knives, packed their spits, and counted their coins, ready to move on to the next town. So picture it, the flicker of flame on metal, the crowd pressed close, the first slice of roast carving through the smoky air. It's loud, greasy, and glorious, the medieval fair at its most delicious, when meat, music, and madness met over a single fire. Traveling bakers renting ovens to vendors. You know those food trucks that rent shared kitchens to prep their dishes? Medieval bakers were already doing it, hauling portable ovens from town to town and renting them out to cooks who needed a little firepower. In the medieval world, ovens were a luxury. Building one wasn't cheap. It took clay, brick, fuel, and space, things few street vendors could afford. But where there's hunger, there's ingenuity. Enter the traveling baker, part craftsman, part businessman, part wandering savior for every pie seller and pastry vendor trying to make a living on the road. These bakers roamed from fair to fair, setting up their portable clay or stone ovens near markets, festivals, and busy crossroads. Their ovens were marvels of practicality, dome-shaped, lined with thick clay or stone, and mounted on wooden carts or sleds. Once fired up, they could hold heat for hours, baking everything from loaves to meat pies. A vendor selling dough, fish, or fruit tarts could rent time and space in the baker's oven, paying by the hour, by the batch, or by the loaf. It was the medieval version of a shared kitchen economy. Not everyone could afford an oven, but everyone needed one. Fishmongers baked their catches in bread crusts to preserve them. Pie sellers cooked portable meals for crowds, and honey merchants caramelized nuts for sweet treats. The baker provided the heat, they provided the food. At the end of the day, both made a profit, and everyone went home full. The traveling bakers themselves were easily spotted. You'd see them arriving early, wagons creaking, clay ovens glowing faintly from the embers of the previous night's bake. They'd set up near the busiest part of the fair, close enough to smell the frying meat and hear the clatter of mugs. Then they'd rake out the ashes, pile in fresh wood, and start renting slots before the crowd even arrived. As the morning sun rose, the scent of bread spread across the fairground, drawing vendors like bees to honey. In some towns, bakers even formed guilds to regulate the trade. They set prices for oven rentals, controlled access to flour markets, and fined anyone who baked illegally. It might sound strict, but it kept standards high and ensured no one's bread came out blackened or raw in the middle. The gilt ovens in cities like Paris or London were permanent fixtures, but the traveling bakers were the freelancers, the ones who kept small fairs and rural markets alive. And their ovens weren't just for food. They warmed hands, baked pottery, and even helped dry herbs for healers. Wherever a traveling baker stopped, community formed around the fire. By nightfall, the fair smelled like heaven. Roasted meat from one stall, baking bread from another, and laughter echoing between stalls. So imagine it, a line of vendors waiting with trays of dough, each one sliding their creations into a glowing clay mouth of heat. The baker wipes his brow, watches the crusts rise, and grins as the crowd gathers for the first batch. No signboards, no delivery apps, just fire, flour, and hustle. The traveling baker was the original power source of medieval street food. Minstrels luring customers with songs. Before jingles, before commercials, before street hawkers yelling, "Hot pies!" medieval food sellers had their own advertising team. Minstrels singing catchy songs to pull hungry crowds toward the fire. If you'd wandered through a medieval market or fair, your senses would have been overwhelmed. Sizzling meat, thick smoke, and the clamor of hundreds of voices. But rising above all that noise, you'd hear something else. Music, the rhythmic pluck of a lute, the beat of a tambourine, and a voice calling out in rhyme. That wasn't just entertainment, it was marketing. Minstrels were the walking, singing billboards of the medieval fast food world. Many vendors couldn't read, write, or afford signs. And even if they could, most customers wouldn't understand them anyway. Literacy was a luxury. So to stand out in a noisy crowd, stall owners turned to sound. A minstrel or street singer could transform a simple menu into a performance. They'd write rhyming jingles about the seller's pies, roasted meat, or ale, often exaggerating shamelessly. "Best goose in the fair, sweet tarts beyond compare." It wasn't truth in advertising. It was entertainment that sold. These collaborations were common at large festivals, where vendors paid minstrels a small fee or free food to sing nearby. The louder and more memorable the tune, the more customers showed up. Some stalls even became famous because of their songs. Travelers could hum a melody they'd heard years ago and instantly remember which vendor sold those incredible honey cakes or that dangerously strong mead. In a sense, the medieval world invented brand jingles centuries early. Only instead of radio waves, they used human lungs. The songs weren't just sales pitches, though. Minstrels added humor, flirtation, and gossip, all crowd magnets. A clever singer might weave the name of a local noble or scandal into a verse, turning every performance into the day's headline. People came for the laughter and stayed for the food. And since fairs and taverns were rowdy, having a minstrel shouting in rhythm kept a vendor's voice from being drowned out. Some minstrels became so popular that their presence alone guaranteed business. They'd travel fair circuits with loyal customers and recognizable catchphrases, medieval celebrities in a way. They'd perform standing on barrels or tables, lute in hand, hat at their feet for tips, singing in rhyme about steaming meat pies, golden ale, or whatever smelled best nearby. But not everyone loved them. Clergymen complained that
Frivolous songs of the market tempted people toward gluttony and sin. Town officials sometimes banned street music for causing public disorder, though ironically, the first thing they did when hosting civic festivals was hire minstrels to draw a crowd. Still, the practice thrived. Music, laughter, and food became inseparable. The minstrel's voice was the bridge between hunger and curiosity, the sound that made you turn your head and follow your nose. So imagine it, the fair in full swing, fires crackling, smoke curling into a blue sky. You hear a clear, bright voice rise above the din. "Come taste the goose so rich and fine. One bite, and joy is truly thine." You smile, you laugh, and before you know it, you're walking toward the song. Congratulations! You've just fallen for the first commercial jingle in history. Jesters or fire eaters performing beside food stalls. Ever eaten street food while someone literally swallowed fire beside you? In the Middle Ages, that wasn't strange. It was good business. Where there was food, there was a show. Medieval fairs weren't quiet places. They were an explosion of noise, color, and chaos. Crowds pressed shoulder to shoulder, the air thick with the smell of roasting meat and hot pastries, laughter echoing over the din. And right next to the food stalls, where the scent was strongest and the crowd was thickest, you'd find the entertainers. Jesters, jugglers, fire eaters, and fools, turning dinner into a spectacle. Vendors understood a simple truth. The more fun people had, the longer they stayed, and the more they bought. So they struck deals with performers. A jester would tell jokes and pull faces while customers waited for their stew. A tumbler would balance on his hands while the baker sold pies. A fire eater would draw a ring of awe-struck children just as the roasted meat was ready to serve. It was marketing through mayhem, irresistible and unforgettable. The jesters were masters of improvisation. They'd hurl insults, crack bawdy jokes, or pretend to steal pies, making the crowd howl. Their humor was wild and physical, a slapstick style that cut across class lines. A merchant and a beggar could laugh at the same gag, elbowing each other while gnawing on greasy meat. The jesters didn't just entertain, they created an atmosphere. Food always tasted better when you were laughing. Then came the fire eaters and flame breathers, the real head-turners. Using secret oils or alcohols, they'd take deep breaths, light torches, and blow out great gouts of flame into the dusk. The sight of fire against the darkening fair sky stopped everyone in their tracks. And conveniently, once people stopped, they noticed the food. A dozen hungry travelers might crowd around a performance and end up buying meat skewers, honey cakes, or mugs of mead just to stay and watch. Some fairs even arranged unofficial entertainment rows where food vendors clustered with performers to maximize the chaos. The laughter, the firelight, the shouting. It was impossible to pass by without stopping. The food and the spectacle blended until you couldn't tell which came first, the meal or the show. Of course, not everyone approved. Priests called the performers agents of gluttony and temptation, accusing them of luring people from prayer to pastry. But no sermon could compete with the sight of a man swallowing fire while a baker flipped hot pies behind him. For a few coins, you got dinner and a performance, a full medieval dinner and a show package.
By nightfall, the fairgrounds looked like something out of a fever dream. Torches blazing, drums pounding, jesters dancing, and smoke from cooking fires curling into the stars. Performers passed the hat for coins, vendors shouted for customers, and somewhere in between, a traveler bit into his first warm meal in days, smiling through the heat and noise. So imagine it, the laughter, the flickering light, the smell of roasted food and burning oil. A jester juggles apples, a fire eater exhales flame, and someone hands you a steaming meat pie. It's loud, it's dangerous, it's unforgettable. And it's proof that in the Middle Ages, every good meal came with a little chaos on the side.